I'm Jessica Morgan, Director here at DIA, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. A special moment for us. Bob, of course, is an artist who we're both considering, inquiring into his practice today, but also celebrating. He's, of course, somebody who has marked our presence here in an indelible fashion, not only with the installation that is upstairs, Excursus, homage to the cube squared, yes, I got that wrong for a moment, which I encourage you all to spend some more time with upstairs. I think actually these cloudy days are some of the best occasions to visit the piece. But of course his impact on DIA extends far beyond this work, the work that was originally made for our space in DIA Chelsea. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that today, into the architecture of the building itself. His impact really on the building is extraordinary. I'm sure as you walk through the space, you'll see the remarkable echoes of the configuration of the installation and the way that he's established the sightlines throughout the building, his use of a particular type of glass, opaque and obscured, within the framing of the views that you have of the exterior of the building. And really, for those of us who come here every week, every day, every month, it's a remarkable experience to witness the change in the horticulture. Bob, of course, was the designer of the garden around the building. It's literally truly a day-by-day experience, and I think many of us, certainly someone like me who only started in January, have been amazed by the changes that take place in the winter months especially. It's really an incredible gift to all of us and to the neighborhood in Beacon as well, where I think Bob is really something of a hero from having had such an enormous impact on this surrounding neighborhood and Beacon in particular. So it is a day to celebrate him. Not only for his work in Beacon, of course, many of us were lucky enough to see his exhibition at the Hirshhorn in DC. It's a remarkable exhibition if you have time. I assume you're all great Bob Irwin fans because you're here today, but you should really make the effort to get on the train and head down to see the show that he's just opened. It's a fantastic exhibition of his early paintings. Bob himself installed it. It's really an incredible experience of that very remarkable building as well. I think, again, witness to his capacity to really take on architecture in a very unique way. And an ending with a new scrim piece, which is really remarkable, so you must go. And we're just ahead of course, another great occasion for Bob. At the sprightly age of 87, he's of course about to open his Chinati commission, the long-awaited work that he has been thinking about and conceiving and now is well into production, and I think all of us will have to make that journey as well after the opening in July to see what will no doubt be a remarkable and permanent presence for Bob in Marfa. So it's a great year for him, or great many years, and I will just say a few thank yous, because of course an event like this is the effort of many people, and I want to thank in particular Kelly Kivland and Stephen Hoban, who've really put together today's agenda and speakers. But of course many others have been involved, and just to name a few of them, Kathleen Anderson, Maria Celli, Max Tononi, Dan Wolf. I'm sure I'm missing many others, but Jim Schauffele, as ever. we almost need to thank Jim for everything. I think really he's our beacon guru. So thank you all for being here, and I'm going to pass over to Kelly, who'll introduce today's speakers. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm Kelly Kivland. I'm an associate curator here at DIA, and it's really such a pleasure to welcome you all to today's symposium. It has been many years in the making, actually. I guess many decades, really. But we first conceived of the symposium about 3 years ago, or started at least the development, once we really began to hone in on the realization of the second installation of Excursus here at DIA Beacon. In the late 1990s, for those that don't know, and Jessica, of course, touched a bit on this, Irwin began to take a series of important projects with DIA. The first was the realization of Prologue, which was the first phase of Excursus at DIA Center for the Arts in Chelsea. and that was in 1998. And over the summer, he made some changes to the work, and that became Excursus, and that was on view again for a year. And within that same time period, Dia approached him to become more or less an artist consultant on the development and master plan of Dia Beacon. And he really took this with great pride. He lived in the area, and he, as you know, has had a great hand in not only the interior of the building, but also the exterior grounds. And so this is really a very special occasion for all of us, including yourselves, to be able to experience his greater practice, really, in terms of his work with gardens, with the development of not only our parking lot and the forecourt, but also the work itself with Excursus. I think it's an incredibly unusual occasion to be able to experience Bob's work in its entirety, and I encourage you all to take a walk during lunch if you haven't already, and I know it's not such a warm day, but if you do get a chance, you can definitely head out to the West Garden, and I do encourage that. So today's symposium gathers scholars, curators, and writers to experience and respond to the work of Excursus. Gathering voices from a range of disciplines, the symposium hopes to match the interdisciplinary ambitions of Irwin himself, who has long looked beyond the realm of studio-based practice to find new meanings in shaping space and human perception. Through focus on divergent discussions of this landmark work, the invited speakers will engage with some of the defining features of his artwork. More broadly, it's including its ephemerality, its site specificity, materiality, its immateriality, and its emphasis on the experiential forms of viewership. As I mentioned, preparations began over 3 years ago, so we've really had a lot of time to work with many of our speakers and to really hone in on much of what they're going to be discussing today. The first part, actually, though, I would like to thank a few people as well. Of course, Jim Shifley, who is a part of not only the installation in Chelsea, but also the installation here, and he worked hand in hand with Irwin on realizing both of those works. So it's really incredible to have him here today as well. Also to Stephen Hoban, our manager of publications, who again really helped to conceive today's content. I also want to thank Jonathan Petkowski, who is our Mellon Fellow, our first Mellon Fellow in 2013 to 2014, and he really helped to develop the intellectual arc of today's speakers as well as its content as well. I'd like to thank Matilda Guidelli-Godidi. She helped in all aspects of research requests and was really pivotal in assisting our speakers. Also, Francesca Logalbo, who was gracious in her help in the hospitality. And as well to the superb staff at Dia Beacon, including Maria Celli, Kathleen Anderson, Maria Catherine Youngblood, Dan Wolf, and Max Hanone. So I'm going to now introduce the speakers. The first part of the day will focus on Irwin's broader practice, as I mentioned, over the last 6 decades. And it will begin with Matthew Buckingham, who will give an artist preface, and will take as his point of departure the artist's changing relationship to photography. He will be followed by Donna DeSalvo, who is a Deputy Director for International Initiatives and Senior Curator at the Whitney Museum of Art. And her focus will be really looking at site conditionality in Bob's practice, a term he has coined, and how this has manifested in a work that she undersaw in 2013, the reinstallation of Irwin's Scrimval Black Rectangle Natural Light, Whitney Museum of Art, 1977. And that was also the year it was first realized. Alva Noe will then conclude the last part of the first session. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley, where he is also a member of the Institute of Cognitive and Brain Sciences. And he will speak on Irwin's work as a mode of investigation of the human experience. We'll then have a short Q&A, and then we'll break for lunch. And then the second part of the day will focus more directly on the work of Excursus. It will begin with Jeffrey Slatnik, an assistant professor of art history and Germanic studies at Indiana University. His talk on Excursus will reveal how the respective practices of Irwin and Albers can be viewed as inflecting understanding of each other. Juliana Bruno, the Emmett Blackney Gleason Professor of Visual and Environmental Studies at Harvard University, and she also wrote about Excursus in her book, Surface Matters of Aesthetics, Materiality, and Media, will discuss how this work creates a relation to surfaces, connecting together materials of canvas, wall, and screen. And we are very pleased to have Matthew Sims, who's a professor of art history at California State University, Long Beach, and the editor of the collected writings of Irwin, Notes Toward a Conditional Art, which you can find upstairs, conclude the afternoon. He will explore how Irwin aimed to realize, for the very first time, the conditions for non-hierarchical aesthetic experience within Excursus. So thank you again to all of you who have joined us today, and I now welcome Matthew Buckingham.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, I also want to thank the DIA organization and Jessica Morgan, Francesca Logalbo, and Robert Irwin for this occasion, and especially Stephen Hoban and Kelly Kivland for the invitation to speak today. I'm deeply honored to be here to talk about Robert Irwin's work from the perspective of an artist. It means a lot to me, and it's very nice to see all of you here. I saw Excursus, Homage to the Square, when it was installed at DIA, Chelsea, and it made a great impression on me. Seeing it again here at DIA Beacon, 17 years later, wandering through its internal spaces, around its perimeter, and weaving in and out in between, I found myself trying to compare the two experiences, then and now. I also found that I was asking myself a new question, one that I'd never considered in relation to a work of art before. The question was, when are you done looking at an artwork by Robert Irwin? I'll try to answer that today, and maybe during the discussion before the break, you may also have an answer to that question. I look forward to hearing that if you do. My first impulse today was to show you things. Photographs, moving images, drawings, words, to give a slide talk, but I'm not going to. When I started trying to answer my own question, when are you done looking at an artwork by Robert Irwin, I recalled Lawrence Weschler's note on the illustrations for his book about Irwin, Seeing is Forgetting the Name of the Thing One Sees. The note on the illustrations for the book explains the relative absence of images depicting Irwin's early work. The note reads, "For many years, Robert Irwin forbade photographic reproduction of his paintings. Irwin felt that a photograph would capture none of what the painting was about and everything that it was not about. That is, a photograph could convey image, but not presence. Furthermore, many of the works are virtually unreproducible. Not even the image of the original, as it were, would appear in a photographic print." Rereading Lawrence Weschler's note on the illustrations, it seemed to me that an image without presence could only be some kind of summary. I thought of other artists who have made similar restrictions on the reproduction of their work, or even banned photographs of themselves. Matching neither artwork nor persona, photography was probably deemed inadequate by these artists, and maybe all the more so because of the claims of veracity made on photography's behalf and the privileges given to it. I share a certain distrust of not only reproductions, but images in general. As an artist, I often choose to work on projects that are about the inevitable gaps and mismatching between images and language. I'm interested in the ways that images fail, the way that they say too much, and also I'm interested in the ways words can fail for being too precise. For this same reason, we also fail language because it is more precise than we could ever be. Precision is not always true. However, I'm attempting something slightly different today with writing and speech. Writing is used to overcome time and space. Handwriting, writing by hand, means making drawings of letters from an alphabet and arranging them according to a coded sequence. Sequences that we call words. And so that when that writing finds a reader and speaker of that language, she can reliably reproduce the sound of each word. In this way, the writing of words may be the first sound recording. Today, I want to use what I've written as a recording so that I can do some thinking aloud without images and have an exchange with all of you. In his writing and interviews, Robert Irwin frequently reminds us that no matter what endeavor we take up, we must begin in the middle. That is where we always find ourselves, he says, somewhere in the middle of things, already thinking in language, holding beliefs, connected with hundreds, if not thousands, of people and communities to which we belong, in a spot that holds us but that we also influence and shape. As an artist, I'm very aware of being in the middle. In the case of giving this talk today, even though I am the first person to speak, I am between my experience of the Robert Irwin piece upstairs and the next thing that I will do, whatever that turns out to be. So I will begin in the middle, gladly. In 1977, Robert Irwin wrote, "There is no longer a word in the English language for our being as a whole complexity, a continuum, or even a word that simply indicates the range of possibilities within which to pose the whole question of consciousness. I have a sense that Irwin was already feeling the enormous lack left by the absence of this word 17 years earlier, in 1960, when he abruptly changed the way he was working. In that year, he moved from making large abstract paintings to much smaller ones. Quoting Lawrence Weschler again, "The result was a series of small square canvases, 12 inches by 12 inches, or 8 by 8, which finally had almost no imagery at all, because of the intimacy of how you looked at them. The gestural concern at this scale began to be replaced by a textural one. The paintings were tightly woven, their surfaces utterly opaque. There was no sense in which they were open windows. Indeed, these canvases weren't even intended to be hung on a wall. They were embedded in thick wood frames that couched the flat surface, not only at the sides, but all the way around. The frame constituted a rich, smooth box for the image. The paintings could be laid on their backs on a table, and they were intended to be picked up and held. The viewer subliminally became involved with the intimate tactile element, the smooth, warm softness of the wood he was feeling, contrasted with the thick swirls of paint he was seeing, but seeing feelingly." End quote. I have never seen these paintings in person. I've only seen them in reproductions that were made recently. If I were giving a slide talk, I would show you, but I'm not. Imagine holding a small, thickly layered abstract painting in your hands, only a few inches wide. Your body more or less surrounds it. Irwin called them handheld paintings. Hand art, like a hand tool. Irwin polished the wood boxes with the oil from his hands, forehead, and nose. An image becoming an object, but still a painting, with a front and a back and a vertical orientation. Irwin never showed these paintings. They were for himself, for research. These paintings remind me of the French word for the present moment, the French word for now, maintenant. This word is derived from the Latin word, manutenere, which means to support or sustain, and which in turn comes from two other Latin words, manus, or hand, and tenere, to hold. Maintenant, to hold in the hand, handheld, like a camera. Now imagine passing to someone else the painting so they can hold that present moment in their hands. The artist and filmmaker Jack Smith, who often used a handheld camera, hated squares and rectangles. He said they were tyrannical, and he wanted to free his art from their confining frames. Sometimes I wonder how he would feel now about the proliferation of rectangles that we live with today. Frames, rectangles mean to tell us where to look, what to pay attention to, what to ignore, and how to discover artists' intentions. Soon after Jack Smith finished his film called No President, aka The Kidnapping of Wendell Willkie by the Love Bandit, in 1967, Robert Irwin was also deciding to escape rectangles. In doing so, he gave up painting as well, partly because he felt the practice was haunted by a figurative tradition that encouraged viewers to look for imagery, figures that were not there. He moved on to circular forms and then to columns, and soon began working with open space. In the work here at DIA, rectangles have come back though, but in a different configuration. Now imagine you are walking through Excursus. In the installation, we pass through door frames, from one framed space to another. In doing so, we discover that we are now in a figure-ground relationship with the work. And if frames indicate what an artist's intentions are, we also plainly see that we ourselves are Irwin's intentions, our movement, our gaze, our experience. Irwin characterizes this condition as a perception-conception relationship. Irwin says that our senses feed perceptual data to the brain, and the brain appropriates and molds it into our reality. For Irwin, each resulting successive abstraction, leading up to our understanding of the world, is actually a loss, not a gain, because we are getting farther and farther from our senses. Irwin's objective has been to create environments that may help strip away our conception, making us more aware of our experience and subsequent thought processes. A further objective is to move us away from quantitative toward qualitative thinking. Quantitative thinking is so useful because it shows us limits and helps us keep score, as it were. Qualitative thinking is adverbial. Imagine your ear taking on the function of your eye. An eye that sees in the passive manner of your ear does not need to blink, and in fact, it could not. It is always taking in the terrain around you, surveying your surroundings. Qualitative thinking allows for what is immeasurable. Your eye, if it were operating like your ear, would still be influenced, though, by an interval in the long but fast chain that begins with sensation and moves through perception to conception. We call that interval, that link, attention. William James said in 1890, "Everyone knows what attention is, but all these years later, it's still hard to define." If we skip the mechanics and look at the effects, we could say that attention is about attending to something. It's probably easy for you to think that you are attending this symposium and my talk. But what about attending an artwork? That's the proposition in front of us. How do we do that? I think it happens by working out context, trying to figure out where you are when there is not a lot of information to go by, and when you feel lost. You become aware of your assumptions, how your experience validates or undermines you. Irwin says that context and standpoint are nearly synonymous. Irwin's projects are sometimes described as interventions. It's an art world phrase, interrupting an action or a space, or in the world of addiction treatment, a professionally directed meeting in which people confront a troubled individual to persuade them to seek help. Maybe we do need help. Marcel Duchamp said, "Art is a habit-forming drug." That's all it is, for the collector, for the artist, for anybody connected with art. It has absolutely no existence as such, as veracity or truth of any kind. But of course, in the art context, an intervention provides us with more art, not less. And we still find ourselves in the middle. As an artist, I relate the feeling of always starting out in the middle to ideas about translation. Using what I've learned to learn something new. Interpreting, considering, meaning, and retranslation. In his book, Strange Tools, Art and Human Nature, Alva Noah, who we'll be hearing from in a few minutes, cites a quotation attributed to James Baldwin. "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been occluded by the answers." I think of artworks as propositions, or sets of propositions that result from a long chain of decisions made by an artist. In his 1977 essay, Irwin compares scientists and artists. He says, at one level, the only difference between them is one of method. The scientist tends to keep an ongoing formal record of his decisions, while for the artist, the art object exists as the inclusive record of his decisions. I believe artists use these inclusive records to turn problems over to spectators, to work on deciphering the record of decisions in an artwork. The spectator uses the artwork to test their own sense of reality. Douglas Crimp says that the neo-conceptual artists of my own generation, of the 1980s and 90s, who I strongly identify with, brought social and political questions into conceptual art practices. For me, installation works remind the viewer that to be is to be somewhere, and somewhere is always a particular place with its own history and context. At present, for us, that site includes a world-renowned collection of art and the longer histories of the Nabisco box printing factory that preceded it, the city of Beacon, and not long before that, the indigenous people living in what has become known as the Hudson River Valley. The space that art makes is a space within which the imagination must go to work. And the labor of imagination, seeing, feeling, hearing things that do not yet exist, is what makes change possible. The visitor is active, aware of their own embodied experience from multiple points of view, both physical and conceptual. Rather than simply communicate information to the viewer, the work makes things communicable and asks the viewer to come to terms with a new experience, to literally find their own words for that. So, what is my answer to the question I began with? When are you done looking at an artwork by Robert Irwin? That, of course, depends on who you are. But for me, the answer is never. The question about how we live through our senses and what we can do with a raised social aesthetic awareness that Irwin's work asks are tenacious. Those questions travel where you go. And anyway, you are always already in the middle. Thank you very much.
So good morning, good afternoon, well, midday, as we would say. So I'm very delighted to be here and want to thank everyone who's been thanked for their invitation, Kelly, Stephen, and Jessica. And very happy to be here to talk to you about Robert Irwin. Mine will probably be the most nuts and bolts presentation, or I should say maybe it's nuts and scrim installation presentation. And I'm very happy in the audience is Jeff Jameson, who has worked with Bob for many years and worked with us on the presentation I'm going to talk about. So you can go to the next slide and get rid of that Whitney thing. Okay. So the title of my talk is, "I Don't Want Any Other Visual Excitation." That's a quote from Robert Irwin, and I'll explain later what that means. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is really a case study of the piece that the Whitney has owned for many years, from 1977, Scrimvale, Black Rectangle, Natural Light, Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, 1977. And that is, in fact, the full title. This work was a gift of the artist and has been in the collection since 1977. You can have the next slide. So this is a photograph, and I appreciate it, Matthew's talking about, in fact, photography, because this is a photograph of the piece as it was installed in 1977 on the 4th floor of the Marcel Breuer building, now known as the Met Breuer. Bob talked about this piece and its importance to him in terms of, as he said, was X marks the point at which I jumped off. So I had never seen this piece before, and so I knew it really through photographs. And it speaks a lot to the mythic aspect of Bob's work and what he has often said about many of the earlier works that he's produced, which actually have that are not known because they ceased to exist. He was particularly attracted to the 4th floor of the Breuer building, and you can give me the next slide, which shows you the floor plan. This is a drawing in the Whitney's collection of how the piece was installed. In 1977, the curator at that time, Marcia Tucker, approached Bob to do really what was a kind of retrospective. In the middle of that, as some of you may know, she was fired from the museum, largely having to do with the Richard Tuttle exhibition, which I think the museum found, amongst other things, very problematic, but it's a good thing because then she went off to found the new museum. So the late Richard Marshall took over the project, At the time, Bob really didn't want to do a retrospective. He was very taken with the fourth floor of the Breuer building with all the particular conditions, and the window in particular, which he said, it had a window that was the architect's revenge. Next. I think has been said before, and I'm sure you'll hear later today, many of the works Bob was making prior to this were paintings. He was engaged with abstract expressionism, and the small handleable paintings that I believe are in the Hirshhorn show, shown in a vitrine, gave way to these other works. And these are two in the Whitney collection. One, these very precise dot paintings, the shape paintings he began to make, and then moving into the discs and this further disillusion of the object, which for him became less and less of interest and also more and more something that just didn't even matter any longer. From these, you can give me the next slide. Bob began working in his studio with different approaches. So there he is in his studio in 1970. And with one of the columns that he was making at the time, he was experimenting with scrim as well. And one of the very first works that he did in an institutional setting was really what has been called a guerrilla work. That's next. This happened at the Museum of Modern Art, working with Jennifer Licht, and it is really his first site-conditioned work in which he used scrim. It's very well documented in Lawrence Wixler's book. Now, what's interesting about this was that the curator at the time and Bob essentially sort of did this, even though MoMA didn't want to support an Irwin exhibition. So they worked at night. He replaced the light bulbs to have a warm and a cool, and they put up the scrim. I guess eventually MoMA had to recognize that this work existed, and of course, like every good institution, then wanted to put up a label to acknowledge what it was. And Bob, if anyone knows him well, knows that those kinds of things are not necessarily unique, or I should say original to the site, so therefore the label became a big problem. So he hired someone, and every day they would go to the museum and they would take the label down. Drives us all mad, but I kind of love it. So this was one of the earliest that he did using scrim. He increasingly more talked about really going out of the studio, and I'm sure others will talk further today about all the theoretical implications of how he thought about site and condition and site specificity and the differences between the two. But again, I'm going to focus really on the presentation of this work, the refabrication of this work, and in a sense, what I learned as a curator through that process. So this was followed next by a piece that he did at the Walker Art Center, and here you see it installed. This piece was also refabricated several years ago as well. And then he did others at the Walker Art Center, at Ace Gallery in LA, at the Fogg, at Harvard, and numerous others. And at the time when we began working with Bob and having this discussion, he was very actively involved with scrim pieces. So I would just show you two that he was, versions, or views, I should say, the Vienna Succession that he was actively involved with. So you have to sort of fast forward a little bit. And I really just show those because at the time that we reached out to Bob in 2012 to talk to him about reinstalling this piece, it was very interesting how he might think about a piece from 1977 and going that far back in time. You know, many artists resist that idea of reproducing or re-engaging with a very new work, a historic work, when they're so actively engaged with new things. But Bob was very delighted. He felt that this had been a very important piece in his development, and as he said to me one day in a very moving way, he never thought he'd see it again. So, next. In our discussions as this evolved, trying to understand what was the genesis for so much of this, and I'm sure maybe someone else will show the slide of this chamber that he was able to have access to, and that's Jim Terrell standing there as well. That was part of the Art and Technology program, and this was at the Garrett Corporation. So this chamber, I'm always bad at pronouncing the name, so somebody can probably... anechoic, I believe. If somebody wants to correct me, feel free. I don't take it personally. I just want to get it right. But this was a non-reflective, non-echoing room that was designed to completely absorb the reflections of sound. So he spoke a lot about being in this room and how it impacted on his own ideas about perception, which is clearly so much the subject of his thinking at that time. Next. So, in a sense, this is a piece that I came to know, and many of my colleagues came to know, through the files. Not quite like J. Edgar Hoover, but nonetheless through the artist files and the documentation files that we maintain on every work of art. So, of course, the very relevant passage here, and this is a letter that was written to Bob from Richard Marshall, the curator, at the conclusion, which says, the restriction set forth regarding the scrim installation is, of course, acceptable. This is documenting his gift to the museum. And the records will indicate that the work, if exhibited again, be faithfully reproduced only in the 4th floor space of the Whitney Museum. Now, at that time, we were in the midst of designing our new building in downtown Manhattan, and it seemed a now or never opportunity to show this work. So this really was, aside from our desire to finally see what this was like as a work, this was really the time. It was a now or never situation. So next. So in talking to Richard Marshall and talking to other people, we tried to sort of figure out what was required. It may look simple, that it's just a piece of scrim that's strung across the width of the gallery, but then going through the files, of course, there were many other things. And then I will say that there were things that were never in the files that we learned in the process and now are in the files. So this is actually the art preparator at the time, their notes about what the piece required. And this is much harder to read, so go to the next one. But there was a U channel that was fabricated. This held the scrim in place, which was then attached to the ceiling. At the conclusion of the exhibition, the scrim, of course, in 1977, museum really didn't keep it, and it was given to Bob Irwin. I have no idea what he did with it, but it may have popped up in some other piece. The channel that was fabricated also no longer exist. So we had these diagrams, and working with Bob and with Jeff Jameson began to really figure out, well, what did this piece need? Could we refabricate it as it was? There were all kinds of very particular kinds of things that we began to learn. The other thing was sort of understanding that this piece was not just the scrim piece, but was part of a larger project that Bob also saw as part of the whole thing, and it was called the New York Projections. So I'm just going to show you a little bit. This is the catalog next that was produced as part of the exhibition. I'm sorry to say that it's very hard to find. It's a gem of a thing, and you can try again, but I think at the time of this exhibition, everyone went online and bought it through eBay and Amazon. But it is reproduced in its entirety on the Whitney website as it's linked to the exhibition, so it's scanned with a new introduction. What was interesting about this catalog, which came out after the show, was how much it really shows you and documents what Bob was doing in the site. So here's the cover, obviously the Breuer building. Next, the grid of the ceiling. Next, the black line that outlines the floor. And next, the floor plane itself. These were the fundamental characteristics of this work that he responded to in the site, in the condition of the site. I think what we were less aware of was something else, and this was the part that went outside the museum, and which Bob called the New York projections. So I'm going to read to you what they are and then show you a little bit. This is Bob Irwin's text. New York projections, the Whitney Museum project is intended to act out, illustrate, and develop the argumentation for perception as the essential subject of art. Assuming that context is not only the bond of knowledge, but the basis for perception-conception, this exhibition has been developed contextually. By holding the most essential contextual thread, those elements taken from perception and used in art, i.e. line, shape, color, etc., and removing in turn each of the additional contextual threads, imagery, permanence, method, painting, sculpture, etc., which have come to be thought of as usual in the recognition of what is art, we arrive at the essential subject of art. In effect, this is accomplished by a principal change in the relationships of the indicator, the object of art, and what it is that is indicated, the subject of art, from their acting as one in the object to their being one in the aesthetic perception of the observer individual. There'll be a test at the end, and you can all really dissect all of that because it's very meaty, as you can imagine. But what was so interesting was to see how, in a sense, the scrim piece in the Whitney was just the beginning. So next, of the New York projections, because what he began to do was to look at the conditions of the site of the Whitney and then begin to find them in the world itself. So here you see the intersection of 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue. What happened was that Bob, along with Richard Marshall and a few other folks, went and painted a black square in that intersection. That became part of the project. Next, now you see where you see the actual intersection painted black. Next, he continued the rectangle by stretching a black cable between two of the buildings at the World Trade Center. Next is what he found in the environment. At the time, he recalled that there were new vapor lights that had been installed around Central Park. And you can see there, and again, these are all reproduced in the catalog, the outline of the rectangle that almost directly mirrors the plane of the fourth floor of the Breuer building. And next, the grid of the city and its various rectangles. And then finally, in this catalog, what he called incidental sculptures. After 1970, he began to move out of the studio into the world. And he talked here about these incidental sculptures, these sculptures in a sense that almost came to being of their own and which he identified in the desert. There was one last project that he proposed that did not happen, and that was to create a laser grid at the third floor level of buildings along Park Avenue between 57th Street and, this goes back a long way, the Pan Am building, which would be just at the very basis. And I will say we did try to see if we could figure that one out, but we didn't quite get there. So maybe someday someone will be able to realize that. So in 1977, there's Bob installing the piece, very hands-on up there. And there you see the grid of the concrete grid of the Breuer building. And the next one is in 1977. You see the installation. Now, I began my conversations with Bob the year prior, and most of it was really by email, on the phone, then contact with Jeff Jameson. But Bob wasn't able to actually come to visit us until May of 2013, and the work was going to be installed in June. I had a major worry the whole time, and that is what you'll see in the next slide. At one point, we decided, to restore parts of the Breuer building, and that included stripping all the wax off of the floors. So there you see the J. DeFeo show, which was the show that preceded Bob's installation, and I think you can tell, hopefully, that that's a very, very different floor than the next okay. There you see the lustrous shine of a floor that's been heavily waxed. And there was a very incredible moment, and any of you who know Bob know he is the consummate gentleman. After all of our discussions, where he put his hands on both of my shoulders and he said, "The floor is a problem." So now, anyone who works in museums knows that we're pretty tightly scheduled, and I kind of anticipated this was going to be a problem. Our extraordinary director of facilities, Peter Scott, was my partner in trying to figure this one out. And how would we manage in the short time around from the deinstallation of one exhibition to the installation of his exhibition, what could we do with the floor? So many, many discussions were had, budgets were reviewed. I knew that it had to happen. There was no other way. So we showed Bob, the next slide. That was a floor on the stairway, where the wax had not been stripped. So we showed him that and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Yeah, that's getting closer." He maintained that the floor had been black, but it was not. The third floor of the Breuer building at one point was painted black. I don't know who did it, but someone did it, and actually did add lamp black to the wax. But that was not the case at the time that Bob had his show. But the lustrous shine is very fundamental, because this piece was installed, and there was no other light but the natural light coming from the window. So we began a series of tests, next, and what was the way that we would go about this? So we, and again, my colleague, Peter Scott, investigated what we could do, and could we paint the floor? What kind of surface could we put that could be stripped off without damaging the limestone? It was a bit tense, and I kept reassuring Bob that we would get there, because I knew somehow we would. And anyway, your job as a curator is never to convey your own anxiety. So we did several tests, and there you see some of them. And essentially we went with 3 coats of wax, and the next slide will show you the different lighting conditions in our very rustic way that we tried to convey. One that would have daylight, one that you would see at night. And Bob was very happy with all of those. So that was a major hurdle. And the next slide, you will see one of our maintenance people putting on the wax, the 3 coats of wax, and then the final result. I will say that because the next show coming after this, we wanted to maintain the look of the whole building. At the end of this whole process, we also had to strip the wax off and bring it back to what it had been. Okay. There was also a lot of confusion, and it's always interesting what memory brings up, and especially if you're working from paper files, a work shown in 1977, staff there, staff not there, and I found this curious document in the files for this giant light, that it's called the Times Square's all-new quartz arc follow spot. And they make a point of saying it can be hooked into household outlets, which I don't believe, but part of it had to do with the idea of when the original show happened in '77, it was during the winter time, and I think there was a great concern that there would just not be enough ambient light, particularly for the opening of the exhibition. So they looked into getting this light, which was going to be positioned on Madison Avenue, shot up to the window on the outside to bring light in. Now, Richard Marshall, who I spoke to, said that he remembered it, but he remembered there wasn't enough money to do it. Bob said he never wanted it. And so it didn't happen. So happy about that. But again, it's very interesting to try to figure out, when you're being this precise, what did this mean? So once we got to that, then it really came down to the fabrication of the piece itself. So next. So there is the bar, which we refabricated. The original one was fabricated in Long Island City. This one was done through another company in New York. And Bob was never happy with the first one, and also couldn't be done quite the way it was done. So we did instead a aluminum bar, and to weight it, there were weights added to it, but it was precisely the same look. It was painted black, and there you see it held up on the sawhorses. Next. The scrim was originally ordered from Amsterdam because of the width. It was 117 feet long polyester scrim. 170 feet. 170 feet long of polyester scrim. We then sourced it from Paris. We also ordered a backup scrim, just in case. So here next you get the sense of what this required, because obviously the tautness of the scrim was probably one of the most critical things. And so it was hoisted into in a very highly choreographed way and brought up to the ceiling. Next. So there's Jeff Jameson, who was on site for 10 days working with our crew. I don't think we would have ever been able to do what we did. Jeff himself is an artist, is a fabricator working with other artists, Donald Judd, and his level of precision was beyond anything I think any of us had ever seen before. Always exciting when one works in that way. There was some change a little bit in the height because we had a big discussion of what the height had been at the time that Bob first installed it. The change we came to that Bob spec'd was 5 feet 7 inches, which, depending on how tall you are, how short you are, you could bump into it. You would have to duck underneath it. The next thing that we encountered had to do with a bit of an improvement with the line. As you can see, what he did from those earlier images that I showed you was to trace really the rectangle of the space itself, the continuation of the line, and actually where it meets then the central line of the scrim. When it was originally done, they used a black tape, almost like a kind of letraset tape. What we decided to do instead, as a bit of an upgrade, was to paint the black line. I will tell you the painter who did this, for some reason, seemed to take longer to paint the line than it took us to put up the scrim, but it looked great. The other thing we encountered is the next, and that is that we had a film on the window because the prior show of J. DeFeo had many works on paper, and so that film had to be removed. And so there you see the film being removed from the window. And then the next, there's the window washer. It's just a kind of cool image out there. But it's so interesting to think of this idea of the site condition and what that really means and what it meant when he did it in '77, and then how the building had changed over time. And on one level, I almost wondered, would he just deal with the site as it was now and what that would be? But then that wouldn't be the piece that he had made in 1977. And in fact, these changes that we made were really minor. Our head of exhibitions wouldn't agree with me, but they were minor fundamentally, and they were things we had done to the space that changed it. So as the end of all of this, we were able to next really come up with a new set of diagrams, documentation for the files, and this was extremely important. So I'll give you the next slide, and thus the title of my talk. When the piece was shown in 1977, this is the checklist from the catalog, and you'll see that essentially what was presented was a kind of mini retrospective of works. I have to put my glasses on or I can't see. That dated from 1958 all the way up to the current piece, column 71, 77. At the time that I asked Bob if he wanted to take on this project, we proposed to him that we would fill the back galleries with works of art and make a kind of mini retrospective. He was adamantly opposed to this. And, you know, we felt this was a great opportunity to show other works of his, but he just said, Don, I don't want to do it. And the phrase he said is, I don't want any other visual excitation. And once he said that, I totally understood what he meant, that those back rooms would be a distraction from what this piece was, that the experience is this piece, this space. And so we didn't do that. What we put in the back room, the next, was something that actually had been in the museum's lobby at the time. And we had a very funny photograph in the archive that none of us could quite figure out where it was, and they eventually realized that it was in the lobby. And that was where he presented the New York projections. So if you go next. So here is what was shown at the time of the 77 exhibition, but that was on the ground floor in the lobby gallery of the museum because this retrospective was in the back gallery. So many of these things that are, again, all in that catalog I referenced, had been faded. There was one that was lost. And we went through a really long process to figure out how we could reproduce them. Now, most of the aerial photographs we learned actually were credited to the Port Authority. Sadly, the Port Authority archives were located in the World Trade Center. And so, as a result of the attacks on the World Trade Center, they were lost. We worked with Bob to rephotograph them out of the catalog. So that was with his permission. We made exhibition copies, which we then destroyed at the end of the exhibition. The next thing we did was to digitize the catalog, have it on an iPad, and have it available for people. Now, there's a quote that Bob wanted on the wall of the museum, and this is what it says. It's there, I don't know if you can read it. If art is about aesthetics and perception, seeing, and knowing in action, can we continue the dialogue for art to be limited to the equal of making? Bob said he never got any answers to the question, but I think, as someone said earlier, that's the question he poses, and we're the ones that are supposed to answer it. At the conclusion of this exhibition, we also engaged in a dialogue with Bob about the future of this work, which, according to the gift of deed, says it can only be in the Breuer building. I went through the exercise, although I knew the answer, to ask him, did he feel differently? Could it be in another space? Absolutely not. So the future of this work will, to a large extent, depend upon if the Whitney claims back the Breuer building, which it still owns and is being leased to the Met. If it's shown at the Met, we'll see where it all goes. The other thing is we have a replication committee at the museum that was established about 10 years ago to determine when works need to be refabricated, exhibition copies, what do those things mean? How do they at times wind up in the marketplace in ways that they should not? And the replication committee agreed that this piece should just be 1977. It should not have a dual date. That's the piece as it is. So here is the work as it was presented in 2013. Next. Next. One thing I'll just stop. Bob never wanted any people in the photographs. However, He had a change of heart. And so for this project, he seemed very happy about that. He even saw people taking selfies in the gallery, and he didn't seem to get upset. So, and then finally, that is Bob standing at the window. I want to just say that this was truly one of the great experiences of my career in life. In fact, I told Bob he made my career, the opportunity to work with someone like him on a project like this. And, you know, to hear an artist say, I never thought that I would ever see this work again, you can't ask for more than that. So thank you very much.
Wow, those were two really good talks. My name is Alvin Noe. I am a philosopher. And I'm going to begin by reading a poem, not a very Robert Irwin-esque poem. It's by Walt Whitman. It's from Song of Myself. I hear the trained soprano. She convulses me like the climax of my love grip. The orchestra whirls me wider than Uranus flies. It wrenches unnameable ardors from my breast. It throbs me to gulps of the farthest down horror. It sails me. I dab with bare feet. They are licked by the indolent waves. I am exposed, cut by bitter and poisoned hail, steeped amid honeyed morphine. My windpipe squeezed in the fakes of death, led up again to feel the puzzle of puzzles, and that we call being. I'm going to do it again. It's hard to hear it the first time. A little faster. I hear the trained soprano. She convulses me like the climax of my love grip. The orchestra whirls me wider than Uranus flies. It wrenches unnameable ardors from my breast. It throbs me to gulps of the farthest down horror. It sails me. I dab with bare feet. They are licked by the indolent waves. I am exposed, cut by bitter and poisoned hail, steeped amid honeyed morphine. My windpipe squeezed in the fakes of death, led up again to feel the puzzle of puzzles, and that we call being. Now, this is a very remarkable poem. It's remarkable for many reasons, but I wanted to... Is the sound okay? Yeah. Is the sound okay, everybody? Am I too close to the microphone? One of the things I think is remarkable about this is that, well, first of all, it's a work of art about the experience of art. Another really remarkable thing about it is that he uses a language to describe this encounter, which is the sort of language you might reserve for the description of bodily appetites and sexual pleasure. So he's really tying his experience of the work of art to the body and to biology and to nature. But at the same time, and this is what I find particularly satisfying, at the same time, he situates those bodily, passionate, sensual pleasures very much in a very sophisticated intellectual and cultural context. After all, first of all, it's a poem. It's a work of literature that we have to exercise all the training and literary competence that we have that lets us even make sense of this. But second of all, what it's describing is the encounter with a trained soprano and her orchestra. It's not a sex act, right? It's music, it's culture. And finally, it culminates for him, I think, in something like philosophy. He says he's led up again to feel the puzzle of puzzles, and that we call being. It's interesting that it's a puzzle, intellectual, but he feels the puzzle. He's gripped by it. He feels the puzzle of puzzles. Now, so one of the things I really like in this poem is not only that it brings out that passion and intellect, body and mind, nature and culture, even philosophy and emotion can be united in the work of art or in the experience of the work of art. But more generally, that it reminds us that in a way these are false oppositions. Bodily arousals are not outside culture. Intellectually bathed perception can be profoundly spontaneous, passionate, can be felt. And I bring this up because I'm a skeptic of the idea that there is, if you like, perception or consciousness or experience that is somehow pure, unsullied by thought, unsullied by language, by concepts, by culture. I think that's a sort of a fantasy of experience. It's actually one that I find artists sometimes are attracted to. The title of Lawrence Weschler's book, which is the quotation from Paul Valéry, "Seeing is forgetting the name of the thing one sees." Ruskin wrote, "Very few people have any idea that sunlighted grass is yellow." I love that. And you find this is an idea you find there's a whole tradition in philosophical writing, not only in the English language tradition, of thinking that experience really, in its true originary form, is somehow unstructured, pre-organized. It's not broken down. I think you also get something like this idea of a kind of pure experience or primitive experience in the talk these days, which is very pervasive in our society, of mindfulness. And you get that in sort of the contemporary Buddhist scene, for example. And there's many, I'm not against that at all. I'm all in favor of mindfulness. But on one way of thinking about it, in meditation, for example, you're supposed to leave thought content behind and reside in something like pure consciousness, which is perceived in this way that I'm skeptical of. Now, I don't know whether this idea has any pull for Irwin. Weschler, in his wonderful book that we all know, sometimes suggests that it does and cites writings of Irwin's that may suggest that it does. But I'm not really concerned with that biographical issue. What I want to stress is that I think that this whole cluster of ideas about experience thought of as a kind of ground floor, pre-conceptual, pre-linguistic, pre-social, pure consciousness, in a lot of ways doesn't make a lot of sense. Consider your current visual experience. Notice. Look. Do we really have any way of gripping that apart from your encounter with where you are, with what there is before you, around you, under you, with the people near you, and this room, this place, on this day? Is there a way, even in thought or imagination, to mute the world in your experience in order to bring out some other purely experiential quality? I don't think so. And even if it were possible, I doubt that in doing so, you would be getting to something primitive or fundamental. You'd simply be transforming your experience. I sometimes teach philosophy to dance students, and I play a game with them. We lie on our backs in the studio. Sometimes we shut our eyes. And one person says a word like cherry. And the task is for each person to say the word when they hear the person closest to them say it. So you lie on your back and you hear cherry, 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 and then eventually you say cherry, and it goes on. After a while, the word loses its familiar quality, and sound and meaning becomes somehow altered. The sound gets divorced from its life as a word. But two interesting points. First, the word cherry doesn't ever become pure sound. If anything, it becomes more like music. That is, it remains, as I believe music always remains, somehow social and shared and communicative and meaningful. And also you don't lose each other in the process. It's still this very social sharing of the word cherry. And second, when you play the cherry game, I don't believe it feels like a return to something more basic. It feels like a playing with and an abstraction away from what is really most basic, namely our joint presence in a shared space. I could go on and on about this theme. Suffice it to say that I'm dubious about the idea that we really live in a kind of experience world, what philosophers used to call the world of sense data, and that we only later impose meaning on it. We live with each other in this world, pure experience in quotes. That comes later when we do things like play the cherry game. Now, Weschler, in his book, quotes Milton Kramer's negative review of the original 1977 Whitney show. Kramer blasted the show as a repudiation of art and life. That was in the New York Times. A repudiation of art and life. And I think Kramer seems to have thought that it was a kind of an anti-art event, no art, just a kind of opportunity for the nothingness of a fictive pure experience, the kind of fictive pure experience I've sort of been myself criticizing. But that's a very unhappy take on Irwin's show, which I saw the restaging a couple of years ago with my then 9-year-old son. Irwin's work is an art of experience, yes, but not an art of this sort of fictive pure experience or an art of introspection. Irwin's work is experiential, or one might have, but one might better have, it's experiential, but one might better have said environmental or even architectural. It is not an art of closing off into the private and ineffable, but rather an art of noticing, of, as my father who's here put it, now you see it, now you don't. His work turns you toward a shared world whose live presence is easily invisible, not because it is unreal or constructed or merely cultural, not because it is removed from the senses, but because it is always and for good reasons in the background. And these facts about the New York projections just bring that out further, that this show is an opening into New York and into the world and into experience. So what I find exciting, speaking as a philosopher, is that in this way, Irwin's work gives us a kind of demonstration, not only of why we do not need the idea of pure experience, but really why experience itself can be, should be, reconceived as precisely our openness to the world around us. Experience, Irwin's work gives us an opportunity to discover, is not an inner field or private event. Experience is not a screen, it is rather an embrace. Experience is not an intermediary, it is an encounter. Experience is not an unstructured, qualitative state, it is the presence of an environment, one where we are at home. There's an old-fashioned party game for children. Each child reaches into a bag whose contents are hidden from view. And the task is to name what you hold in your hand. Even commonplace household implements, such as a comb, a cork, a thimble, a feather, a sponge, a spoon, can be delightfully baffling. To the touch, they can seem fragmented and disunified. The moment of recognition is thrilling, and also really in its own right a striking phenomenon. Beneath your touch, the properties assemble themselves as integrated wholes. Now they, the objects rather than the isolated qualities, show up in your experience. Irwin's work has something of this quality for me. Entering one of his installations is a little like putting your hand in the bag. You think, you look, you observe, you notice, and in doing so, you bring the world into focus. The world shows up for you. And moreover, and this is the magic of art, and I think also the magic of philosophy, you get to catch yourself in the act of bringing the world into focus. And this is why, I think, Irwin can say, as he was quoted as having said in the brochure that accompanied Excursus, which I read back in 1998 when it was at DIA, to be an artist is not a matter of making paintings or objects at all. What we are really dealing with is the state of our consciousness and the shape of our perception. The act of art has turned to a direct examination of our perceptual processes. So I think of Irwin's work, in the way I've sketched, as actually making a contribution to our understanding of consciousness. It reminds us, or teaches us, or reassures us that doing this, making a direct examination of perceptual consciousness, is not turning away from the world, but turning towards it. And not only that, it's turning towards it in a way that is gentle, fun, amusing, and strikingly social. So one of my vivid memories, and in a way this is probably everybody's experience, but one of my most vivid memories from late 1998 and seeing that show was, actually, was it open in the evening? Because I remember it as being so dark. I remember a very dark space. Maybe it was a winter afternoon. And this sense of this sort of magic space where other people appeared and disappeared and came in and out of view. So it was an intensely and almost playfully social space, social experience. Now, in a way, I think all art does this, or something like this. All art plays, and I think always has played, some version of the put your hand in the bag and catch yourself in the act of bringing what is there into focus game. The means vary from place to place and era to era. Leonardo did it differently from Picasso. But art is always this kind of question. And I was also going to give the Baldwin quote, art uncovers the questions that have been occluded by the answers, or art lays bare the questions that have been occluded by the answers. Far from turning away from art and life, as Kramer said, Irwin is carrying on both. An artist whose work accomplishes something at once similar and at the same time radically unlike Irwin is Richard Serra, whose work we can also go look at this afternoon. He too makes places that afford you the opportunity to catch yourself in the act of being there. This is environmental work. This is experiential work. This work affords noticing and affords the kinds of reorganization that come from noticing. But his work does this by what can maybe be described as violent means. To me, Serra's work, which I also admire, is roller coaster art. We are in the vicinity of fight or flight. Serra makes something happen. The work disorients and compels. This is experiential work because it's psychological. Irwin's work is not psychological in that way, I would offer. So consider scrim veil, black rectangle, natural light. There's no mystery, no magical ingredient, no bang on the head. A large rectangular room divided lengthwise by the scrim, hanging down to about head height. The fabric is translucent, from some angles invisibly transparent, from others impossible to see through. Sometimes you can see it, sometimes you don't. The fabric has a thick black border. There's a thick black line painted on the walls, bisecting them horizontally. Light comes through the single large window at the end. And yet you could practically hear people gasp as they entered the room on the Whitney's 4th floor. There is an optical trick, I feel. There's something optical going on. You could not always quite see the scrim, and because of the black line of its border and the similar line on the wall behind, you had a sense that the two lines were one, and so you lost a sense of their location in space, or that was my observation. But the fascination of this piece doesn't come down to mere optical play. What does it come down to? One remarkable feature of the installation is that it has no focus. You're in it, for one thing, so you can't look at it. And there isn't any one thing for you to look at or contemplate anyway. Or rather, everything, the window, the scrim, its border, the floor, the wall, the other people in the gallery, command attention equally. So James Turrell's show was up at the very same time that this was up, and I thought it was so interesting in this regard. By and large, at the Turrell show, I always knew what I was supposed to focus on, what the object of attention was supposed to be, where the effect was located. There was something to inspect, but not so with the Irwin. There's nothing to do in that installation, or there's everything to do, for the installation is just a place to be, a pure place, space, not pure experience, but pure place. And maybe that's a way to organize our thinking about Irwin. His is an art of place, an art of openness to place. He doesn't urge, command, invite, or necessitate the way Sarah, for example, does. He lets us be. Now, Irwin's words, which I quoted earlier, to be an artist is not a matter of making paintings or objects at all. What we are really dealing with is our own state of consciousness and the shape of perception, might have been uttered or even written by John Dewey. He also urged us to think of art as directed toward experience. It is the existence of art objects, Dewey wrote, this is not a quote, that gets in the way of our understanding of art, which has nothing to do with things, but with experience. And Dewey, in his book Art as Experience, which I recommend to you, has very interesting things to say about experience. Experience for Dewey isn't triggered in us by objects, environments, works of art, or anything else. For Dewey, and this is a theme in all of the work I've done in philosophy, for Dewey, although I didn't get it from Dewey, actually, I discovered Dewey late, for Dewey, experience is something we make. And all experience, he thought, is aesthetic. For him, that term, aesthetic, refers to qualities that make experience what it is, experience. Integration, balance, coherent. There aren't, for Dewey, aesthetic and non-aesthetic experiences. If an experience is non-aesthetic, it's not an experience. It's just a pile of sensations, maybe. An experience for Dewey is not about sensation. It is, in a way, something more like an artwork. So for Dewey, we are all artists all the time. So who needs art? This is a question that Irwin's work seems to invite. Who needs art? The world is already art. That is, it is already the occasion for all the experience you could need or want. And yet Dewey seems to have thought there is a special job for the artist. There is a distinctively aesthetic task at which he or she aims. And this is that of assembling opportunities for experience that may have no function or no function other than to exemplify the integration of parts that makes any experience an experience. Or as I've been putting it in my remarks thus far, the artwork gives us an opportunity, or the work of the artist gives us an opportunity to catch ourselves in the act of doing what we always are doing, achieving contact with the world around us. And to relate this to an idea which is important in my last book, Strange Tools, artists don't, I would suggest, in a sort of Deweyan spirit, and I think very much in sympathy with Irwin's project, Artists don't make stuff because what they make is special. They make stuff because making is special for us. It organizes our lives and organizes what we are. What artists do really is take the stuff we make and put it in a brown paper bag, if you know what I mean. The upshot of this is not just that art can be a way of investigating experience, but actually, it may be that art and philosophy, I say art and philosophy, it's something I haven't really gone into, may be the only way to do this. I'd like to end, and I'm coming to the end, on a somewhat autobiographical note. As I've already indicated, a central theme of my approach is that experience, perception, consciousness, is not something that happens inside of us. It's something we do. It's something we enact or perform or achieve, and something that we can fail to achieve. And like everything else that we achieve, we do so only as embodied and situated in an environment that includes other people. And this has big, big implications, I think, for the whole project which I've been involved with of sort of trying to understand consciousness in a more natural scientific framework. I think the reason that scientists haven't found consciousness in the brain is that consciousness isn't in the brain. But not because it's somewhere else. Consciousness isn't somewhere. It's something we do. Looking for it in the brain is like looking for dancing in the dancer's arms and legs. Which is not to say that dance doesn't depend on the arms and legs, or that experience more generally doesn't depend on the brain. The idea that experience is confined to the brain is not just a theory of what the brain is doing, it's, I think, a confining, straitjacketing conception of what experience can be. What the experience in the head view says is that presence, the world's presence in our lives, the presence of other people in our consciousness, and our presence in the world around us, our presence here and now on this ground, is a kind of confabulation. Really, when all is said and done, we are confined to the contents of our own heads. I think it's really remarkable how seldom it seems to fully be appreciated that sort of hard science tends to be committed to this kind of matrix-like fantasy of us. Anyway, in my own work, I've been trying to show how actually a more better conceptually grounded way of thinking about experience would require us to get out of our heads and look at the way in which brain, body, and world and other people together make experience happen. Now, when Kelly Kivland invited me to join you for this presentation, it was because, as she wrote to me, she thought that my work on the topics of perception and consciousness might provide some insight into articulating or thinking about the significance of Irwin's sight-conditioned artworks. But what she didn't know, and this is the biographical part of what I'm mentioning now, what she didn't know is that my own framing of this problem in my own work sort of dates to my reading those quotes in the brochure at DIA back in 1998. I'd been already striving at that time to articulate a conception of experience as embodied, but shortly after that, I was invited. It was the first time I was ever invited into a kind of art-science cross-disciplinary meeting. I was invited by Lawrence Rinder, who some of you may know, to be part of a brainstorming thing for an art-science consciousness workshop that was a planning event for a show he was doing. And I basically came in and said, science really can't quite play the role in this conversation that you want. It's art that is going to be the tool we need to study perception and consciousness. And I gave the Irwin quotes. I gave this quote, which I already read, but I'm going to read it again. To be an artist is not a matter of making paintings or objects at all. What we are really dealing with is our state of consciousness and the shape of our perception. The act of art has turned to a direct examination of our perceptual processes. So a question for me and a question for philosophy is, how should we're all ending on questions, how should we think of human experience? How should we conceptualize, how should we understand what a human experience is, such that art can be, as I agree with Irwin that it is, and that maybe only art can be, an investigation of human experience. Thank you.
Yes. Good morning. Hello. Is this mic on? Can you hear me?
I think it's on now, yeah.
So I guess I would like to ask whichever speakers to respond to this apparent tension between presence, as mentioned by Mr. Buckingham, and I guess Donna DeSalvo, you had mentioned also a quote that related to essence, trying to get back to an essence. And so I'm wondering if the provocation, the challenge that Professor Noe has offered is in some way a challenge to that underlying essentialism that I perceive in your discourse as kind of trying to return to some essential or pure being. And I guess just for fun and good fun, could you respond to what does seem to be a discursive challenge to the ways that you were framing your arguments?
You weren't talking about essentialism, were you? I don't think you were
I didn't use that word, no. No, I wasn't talking about
I mean, I think it would be almost the opposite of something like that, because I think that what he did, at least in the 77 piece, and I think what he does throughout his work, is actually quite the opposite, which is this extraordinary openness to seeing what is there and letting that guide things. And, it's interesting because I was going back to look through his own description of the difference between site-conditioned and site-specific, which I think sort of gets to that. And he, I'll find one.
I guess one quote that you had mentioned was he said, the removal of context in order to arrive at the essential.
Oh, you're talking about Irwin's statement about the New York projections? Well, I'm not certain I can answer that, because I have to tell you that I struggled with that text myself and trying to really unpack it, and I don't think he meant essence in quite that way. I really don't. Essence or essentialized, I don't think in quite that way. That's my read of it. So I can't respond to specifically what he was getting at there. I mean, I think that whole idea of, if you want to look at the essence as being the rectangle, the shape, the grid, those certain kind of formal qualities that he then found. And that's an important word, because the fact of the matter is that he experienced each one of those new conditions through, yes, something that he perceived in the context of the Whitney site in the Black Plain, but then he found them in each one of these new locations. So, and I don't think that's just an overlay of an existing idea onto something, because they change throughout. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, and I would also say that I agree with this, with what Donna and Alva are both saying, because I guess what I was trying to address was this idea that you always begin where you are already, and that's always a complex position, no matter how we experience it. And that Irwin, in my own experience, is creating these spaces where that is more easily revealed to us as spectators. And I think the other side of that, for me, I find the language very interesting. It was really interesting to go back and read interviews and essays back to back, rather than connecting them over years. And it was interesting to see these shifts of language, but to me they were just more cultural differences between how the ideas evolved over time, rather than a question of an essentialism or something like that. And
if I could just say very briefly, what I was trying to do was, See, I'm one of those people for whom, without the word, it's hard for me to get going seeing. I really need the conversation with the people I'm with to begin to make. So in 1998, it was that brochure that really helped me, and I've cited that brochure, and I can't tell you how many different talks and papers that I've given over the years, or the quotes from Irwin that were given. They were actually from much earlier interviews, actually, than the installation of the 90s. But for me, there was a beautiful question there. Art aims at perception. Art is is directed towards a sort of unveiling or discovering, or not my words, research into experience itself. So what conception of experience can we work with to help unpack that and understand that? And I tried to take a stab at that today.
Okay, I think we're going to take one more question. Great,
yes,
thanks.
thank you. I wondered what any of you thought of the whole idea that seeing is forgetting the name of the thing one sees. I mean, is Irwin's work most successful when you're not sure what it is? Is it the windows in this building, the parking lot, or just a screen in a giant room where you don't quite know where the art is? Is it part of the experience of it not knowing what it is and being confused by this experience and not sure what words to use to describe it?
Yeah, thank you, David Rothenberg. In a way, that was sort of what my talk was aiming at. I think that one of the things which is characteristic of Irwin's work is an initial, now you see it, now you don't, or now you don't see it, and then spending time with it, looking, listening, talking, noticing, brings it into focus. I've talked a lot with Ren Weschler about his view on this. He claims that every time he's with Irwin, and they'll look at something together, Weschler, if you know him, is an extremely verbal person, and he'll say, "Oh, that reminds me of," and Irwin will say, "Shut up! Can you just look and not tell us what it reminds you of? Can you stop labeling it and just look for a moment?" So I think there is an interesting tension between those impulses.
Oh, I was going to add, I think that, during the whole course of the project, and my other colleague that I worked with on it was Jane Panetta, our associate curator, and there are times we kept saying, what is this thing? And, I was thinking about Warhol, who said, once you label something, you can never go back. And so I do think it's that, and even the descriptions, for the most part, at least in the case of the 77 piece, they kind of describe. If you were a cataloger in a museum, it would be a descriptive title. And so I think that's very much this idea of really, acknowledging, and perhaps even more so than ever in a culture that labels everything, and people, I might add, as well, if you want to talk about being essentialized, I think that's one of the great strengths of what Bob's work is this capacity to immerse yourself. And maybe, yes, there's delight, but there's also discomfort. And so when he said that people got off or didn't get off the elevator, we've just installed a Michael Heiser piece at the museum, and we have to get people off the elevator sometimes because it's dark. And, it's so interesting what will bring people in and not bring people in, and the real issue of discomfort and expectations. I found that I have to just say this quick quote that I found from him. I just love it, because he said, "Sometimes you put in 20 pounds of effort and you get 100 pounds of result. If the means are too obvious, or if the effort is too ponderously complex, if one of your responses is, quote, 'Gee, this is a lot of work,' then you've completely lost it." And although that has a humor to it, I also think it speaks to the kind of ineffable quality of immersion and just kind of letting yourself go. And I think that's what I admire about his work, is this capacity to somehow jump. As he said, X was the point at which I jumped off. And so what is it? I don't know what it is. I don't know what it's called. There are things that are beyond language in that, to that extent.
And one of the things which I think is so beautiful about this exact topic is that it brings together something profoundly deep, philosophical, the limits of experience and its connection to language, culture, thought, on the one hand, and a very real practical problem that curators and museum folks face of showing, presenting, and making accessible work, and putting words to it. I'm very interested in the way in which words, when you and I later walk through the museum and look at something together, the way in which we in our conversation can actually enable our attention or facilitate our discovery and actually move us from seeing to seeing differently, or from not seeing to seeing. So I actually think of this whole museum problem as a kind of applied philosophical problem.
Boy, that's an interesting one. That's another symposium.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to Elva, to Matthew, to Donna. We really appreciate your thoughts.
Okay, welcome back. Again, I would like to thank the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. I was saying at lunch that I wish that I had read the morning's papers before I wrote my paper, because I think it would have been rather different. But I suppose that's the makings or the mark of a good symposium. I've learned a lot already. I wanted to, in addition to the organizers, thank the Josef and Annie Albers Foundation and Brenda Danilovitz, who's here. She's the chief curator of the foundation, because they allowed me to, they actually printed some negatives of images that I'll show you today specifically for this talk. So thanks again. Okay, before I begin with a kind of the more formal aspect of my presentation, since I'm the Albers guy on the on the panel, I'm not sure how much people know about Albers. So I'm just going to provide a little additional information that I don't talk about in the formal aspect or part of the talk, but I think might be relevant as the day progresses. So I imagine most of you know that Albers was a student and later taught at the Bauhaus, first in Weimar and then in Dessau and in Berlin. He was also the only member of the stained glass workshop in Weimar. Indeed, within this documentary photograph, which I'm showing you, we only see Albers' work. And one of the pieces that is in the windows in the background, the piece in the left-hand window, is the piece that you see represented in color. I think that Albers worked in this medium is rather interesting in terms of what kinds of relationships we can draw between Albers and Irwin. It shows us that even in his early work, Albers was drawn to unstable material. Glass is an amorphous solid, it's unfixed, and light was required to animate these glass works, light itself being another variable element. Albers also would occasionally work in glass later in life. Here, a window he designed for a private chapel within Marcel Breuer's St. John's Abbey complex in Collegeville, Minnesota. The glass used is photosensitive, so that the tonalities that we see correspond to the duration of exposure to ultraviolet light. It's not an assemblage, and no surfaces have been removed from the panel as Albers had done previously. In the yellow example, although it's very difficult for you to see, channels of glass have actually been removed from the surface of the work so as to create a sense of some kind of depth. But again, considering the topic of the symposium, I would be remiss, I think, in not mentioning that Albers, at a very early point in his career, worked with light as a medium. Okay. As Robert Irwin has said, he was drawn to Josef Albers, who made over 2,000 homage to the square paintings between 1949 and 1976 because of his approach to color as a kind of infinite possibility. He regrets his reference to Albers in the title of Excursus, homage to the square cubed. This is not especially surprising in light of Irwin's aesthetics. His reference to Albers' canonical series of paintings invites direct comparison between Excursus and Albers' work. And while it's true that Irwin's arrangement of theatrical gels creates optical effects similar to those achieved in his paintings, in Albers' paintings. Here you see some hues are brought to the fore, while the edges of others seem to dematerialize due to color interaction. Such a reductionist approach to the work is out of step with an understanding of Excursus as a site for phenomenal encounter that is contingent upon one's experience of the work. The effect of the work, which is contingent upon atmospheric conditions, the time of day, the number of bodies ambulating throughout it, etc. Albers need not play a role in this per se. And Irwin would seem to have accounted for this. An excursus is meaningful only to those who want to find significance in it. In literary prose, an excursus doesn't serve the narrative. In academic prose, an excursus is appended to the text, a footnote added to enhance or elaborate upon points made within the body of the text over and above that which is necessary. Irwin's excursus could be seen as moving Albers' project to demonstrate the interaction of color into 3 dimensions, or not at all. This afternoon, I offer my own excursus, an even further elaboration that shows how the composition of one of Albers' lesser-known works, his mural for the Corning Glass Building, and the circumstance of the space in which it was installed coalesce with aspects of Irwin's practice. To be clear, Albers and Irwin are quite different artists. Although perception is a kind of currency to both, Albers sought to impose a challenging pictorial logic upon the viewer so as to encourage visual awareness. Irwin creates perceptual circumstances through which awareness of self in space comes into being. I don't intend to suggest otherwise. I would like to suggest, however, that Albers shared Irwin's interest in relationships between form and appearance, the immeasurable, and in disorientation as a productive state, albeit differently directed. Toward this end, I'll triangulate the visual dynamics of Albers' linear constructions with approaches to built space in mid-20th century architecture and with Irwin's early installations. In the late 1950s, the architects of the Corning Glass Building in New York asked Albers to create an artwork for the building's lobby. For this commission, he and Wallace Harrison turned to 2 of Albers' previous linear constructions as the basis for a 60-foot-long, 13-foot-high mural. This was Albers' first opportunity to render a linear construction in large scale. And I think actually there's something quite interesting about how at this moment Albers is getting bigger, pretty much as big as he ever got, when Irwin, as we learned this morning, was getting smaller, making these tiny paintings in 59, 60, 61. In 1948, 1 year before making his first homage to the square, Albers began a series of drawings, engravings, and prints known as Transformations on a Scheme, which he continued as the series Structural Constellations. Like his homage to the square series, which explored the interaction of color as a means for perceptual attunement, Albers' linear constructions realized a comparable outcome through the calculated arrangement of line. Somewhat humorous notes on drawings related to the series suggest that the 2 projects, his projects about color and line, were conceived of together and according to the same geometry. For example, and you may not be able to see this, Albers notates the drawing on the lower left with owning a square, square dancer, and Gezeichnet drawn or plotted. With respect to painting, after nearly a decade of experimentation with other pictorial formats, Albers determined that asymmetrically nested squares of varying sizes, arranged symmetrically on a vertical axis, offered a design constraint that could be utilized to explore the dynamics of color relationships ad infinitum. Soon after, George Hurd Hamilton cast Albers' use of the square as an active tool in his search for a reality that is constantly changing, thereby succinctly articulating what would be Albers' life pursuit, rendering work that demonstrated visual flux, or as Hubert Damisch has said of Albers, a veritable but strictly experimental culture of the eye. He employed the square similarly to convey the plastic dynamics of line in his linear constructions. One sees at upper left how Albers rotates a square on an axis in order to construct a scheme that, when divided into equal diagonal segments and with the addition of darker lines and shading, produces the appearance of a three-dimensional volume. A finished work, often engraved in black laminated plastic and abraded in areas to produce shaded planes, derived from what Elaine de Kooning described as a long, torturous series of sketches. Albers never did anything by half. There are thousands of these sketches. It's amazing, actually. After de Kooning's 1950 visit to Albers' studio, she wrote, "The lines that form his brittle diagrams are diminished here, lengthened there, made finer and heavier, juggled to yield up a constantly increasing number of relationships." His design for the Corning glass mural was incised in white marble and then filled with gold leaf. Although visual destabilization was a common theme in Albers' practice, it is most explicit here. He wrote a detailed, unpublished analysis of the mural, which I'll read almost in full. Try to follow along with the image if you can. All lines follow only three directions. They meet in angles of 3 different degrees only, producing herewith 8 dominant parallelograms. These 8 lozenge shapes are equal both in size and attitude. They group themselves within 4 pairs. Though these pairs seem on different levels, they remain in elbow touch. Then, in the 2 centers, a 3rd parallelogram of similar size but different attitude occurs. This lozenge presents a perpendicular connection within the pairs and for the 2 pairs simultaneously. It also shapes them into something like U-shaped hinges. Secondly, this lozenge interlocks these hinges in a way possible only in 2-dimensional illusion, but impossible in 3-dimensional reality. By emphasizing through heavier lines 2 connected edges within. The dominant lozenges within the dominant lozenges, the latter seem to lose their equal attitude. As a consequence, we read them now in different directions, front and backward, up and downward, left and rightward. As Albers makes quite clear, the work consists of immeasurable and unresolvable ambiguities between 2- and 3-dimensional space, which is quite in keeping with his interest in Gestalt psychology or relationships between form and appearance generally. This disorientation, induced by the linear interplay of Albers' composition, was amplified by the disorienting spatial dynamics of the site in which it was installed. A contemporary description of the Corning glass building noted that the illusionistic space of the building's lobby was so outrageously successful that even after one perceives that the white marble columns do not really change to black marble at the halfway point, but are simply mirrored in a ceiling of black glass, one's heart of heart persists in knowing that the space exists more truly as emotionally experienced than as cerebrally debunked. To my ear, this response to the spatial dynamics of the Corning glass building's lobby sounds quite like one's experience of Irwin's work. Yet it predates his installation known as the Room at the Museum of Modern Art by 11 years. It predates his Whitney retrospective, for which he created Scrim Veil Black Rectangle Natural Light, by 18 years. In 1959, as we know, Irwin was painting abstract canvases in Los Angeles. As many here know, at the Museum of Modern Art, Irwin altered the fluorescent lighting scheme of an empty gallery and suspended a translucent scrim at the midpoint and 4 feet from the ceiling, thereby creating 3 zones of light intensity: above the scrim and closest to the light source, as diffused by the scrim, and below but not under the scrim. As he said, everything in the installation conspired to skew one's expectations so that your perceptual mechanism became tilted, and you perceived the room as you otherwise might not have done. I imagine many of us recall Lawrence Welsher's description of seeing Scrim Veil Black Rectangle Natural Light upon entering the 4th floor of the former Whitney Museum. Already as you walked out of the elevator, you were triangulating, calibrating, trying to get a fix on your spatial relation to the gallery. Like many of Irwin's works, Albers' mural and the architecture of the Corning Glass Building's lobby conspire with one another to set those who move through the lobby off balance. Indeed, the effect of the mural was amplified by a modernist architectural understanding of space, spaces that were themselves the subject matter of art, spaces that were understood as a continuum rather than as something enclosed, of spaces that were animated from within, spaces that have been described as voids filled in part with individual objects and in part by air, in which it is possible to compose objects in such a way that they evoke the idea of a volume of air bounded by them. So many of Irwin's works appear to be continuous spaces animated from within, by light, by us. To speak of the materiality of a work like Excursus as defining a volume of air seems most apt. Furthermore, Irwin's works for the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney Museum were installed within spaces in which visual contemplation was meant to occur. He who entered these galleries was primed to look at something, which makes the ambiguous situation Irwin presented even more effective. That Albers' mural is installed in a lobby also is significant. Lobbies were, and perhaps still are, socially ambiguous spaces, a fact upon which architects capitalized in the late 1950s and early 1960s. They were hybrid sites for exchange where, in government buildings, for instance, lobbyists conducted business off the record. And they were spaces in which, as Mark Jarzambek observed, the rules of etiquette became confused. A gentleman would remove his hat upon entering the enclosure of an elevator, should a lady be present, yet he would don his hat even if ladies were present in the lobby of the same building, despite it too being interior space. Lobbies also provided architects with high-profile opportunities to craft distinctly modernist spaces. The Corning Glass Building was one of several noteworthy office towers constructed in New York in the late 1950s. Ludwig Mies Monteroa's Seagram Building opened in 1958, followed by the Corning Glass Building in 1959, and Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill's Union Carbide Building in 1960. The lobbies of each building articulate a fluid approach to architectural space. The Seagram Building's public plaza is slightly above the street, and thus spatially distinct from the rhythms of the street. The boundaries between it and the building's lobby are blurred. The pink Swenson granite of the plaza extends into the lobby, and thus the distinction between inside and outside appears inconsequential. One sees the illuminated travertine-clad walls of the lobby before entering. The bronze-sheathed columns of the interior are in line with those external to the building, etc. This slippage between interior and exterior emphasized the spatial ambiguity of the building's lobby, much of which, one could argue, is external to the structure. Like the Seagram building, one entered Skidmore Owing and Merrill's Union Carbide building via a glass-walled structure set within the building's footprint. In what was described as an impressive and dramatic approach, one then rode an escalator to the second story and emerged into a 20-foot-high, intensely lit space that wrapped around the central elevator core. The illusionistic quality of the ceiling as an indoor sky and a plane of light was noted in Architectural Digest. Yet, of course, this level of illumination was entirely unnecessary. Rather, the ceiling fashioned a space of the lobby as indistinct by creating the appearance of an alternative environment housed within the building's envelope, and by creating the appearance of an infinite spatial continuum. The effect was continued on each floor of the building. All 53 floors had this distinctive ceiling. And in fact, so as to not break the illusion, if there was a room, you can see that there are kind of cubbies or offices that are marked out in a grid on the office floor. And if one of those spaces needed to be darkened, mirrors were placed in the space at the upper point of the wall so that the illusion of the ceiling running through the building was maintained, and the room could also be darkened. The interior spaces of the Corning Glass building also were a fluid spatial continuum. There are rooms with ceilings that create the illusion of natural light. Glass walls delimit interior spaces while offering a view onto adjacent spaces. One could see figures moving through these spaces, sometimes clearly, sometimes in shadow, if behind draperies or frosted glass panels. It's really a pity that there aren't good color photographs of the interior, or at least that I haven't been able to find them. The doors were made of ebony. The carpeting in some spaces was golden yellow, the sheer volume of which was described as drenching the eye. And as we see here, in the contemporary time and life building, bold juxtapositions of dark and light, as well as lighting effects, were employed to articulate spaces within spaces. Color and light bisected the halls. A soffit concealed lighting that illuminated half of the ceiling. The colors of the flooring, walls, and elevators are reversed on opposite sides of the room. A similar, albeit subtler, opposition existed in the hall leading to the executive suites of the Corning Glass building, with opaque matte milk glass on one side and clear reflective glass on the other. Now, as the description of the Corning Glass building, which I read previously, indicates, one entry into the space must have been a kind of awesome experience. Promotional materials for the building proudly describe entrances on 56th and 55th Street that lead into a 3,000 square foot lobby with a mirrored ceiling of black Carrera glass. Recessed lighting apertures cut into the glass send illumination down to the white terrazzo floor and provide a constantly changing pattern of reflections. Here, we see how the mirrored black glass appears to double the 16-foot tall space. Bodies moving through the space are reflected in the ceiling as light bounces off glass and highly polished marble walls. The carpeting in the elevators was a bright crimson, in contrast to the gold lines of Albers' mural, which they faced. The interplay of image and surfaces began before one entered the lobby. Approaching the building, one viewed the space first through the green-tinted glass panels of the building's skin. One saw inside, one saw one's own reflection, one saw the movement of the streetscape behind. And once inside, one saw Albers' mural in double, as reflected by the lobby's ceiling, which further complicated the mural's inherent visual ambiguity. Harrison and Abramovitz crafted a space that exhibited flux through its internal animation. This was intensified by the visual ambiguity of Albers' mural, it being a composition that demonstrated flux through its shifting and unstable dimensionality. Likewise, what we might call the effective form of Albers' mural was dramatically amplified by the spatial circumstance in which it was situated. As Albers remarked, the mural presented an invitation to observe a visual play of interacting directions with a continued change in the meaning of form, and through changing viewpoints and standpoints, an invitation to thinking in situations. Thinking in situations was a phrase Albers used to describe thinking creatively, of employing a flexible, imaginative mind. This is so similar to how people were describing Irwin this morning that I started to think at times they were actually talking about Albers instead of Irwin. This distinction is made by Albers to distinguish between quantitative and qualitative thinking about form and art. For Albers, the most important goal of all was to move us toward having visual agency. He was, after all, a pedagogue. The Corning glass mural, as informed by the unusual spatial dynamics and aesthetics of the space in which it was installed, is quite successful in achieving this end. It also allows us for an embodied thinking, which brings us back to Irwin's Excursus. And I think that Irwin, in a way, as I hope to have shown in my Excursus, has given us liberty to think of Albers in these terms by reflecting retrospectively on his practice through Irwin's lens. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Kelly Kivland and Stephen Holben very much for this invitation and for convening this fantastically interesting conference, and everyone at DIA, including Francesca Logalbo and Matilde Guidelli, for making it possible for all of us to be having this incredible dialogue about Irwin from completely different points of views, but with many ideas that I think really resonate across the papers, mine included, as you will see. I'm going to offer a kind of personal experiential excursus with this paper titled Screening Light Space, Robert Irwin's Architectures of Atmosphere. And I'd like to start with a quote from Nietzsche, who claimed that all living things require an atmosphere around them, a mysterious, misty vapor. It is 1998. You've come to Chelsea, a New York City neighborhood that at this time is more commercial than residential. The urban scene is somewhat barren. You pass by warehouses and gigantic spaces, garage spaces, while people work in the wide streets enlivened by the Hudson River light. Walking to the end of 22nd Street, you enter a multi-story building that was a former warehouse. You're now in the large space of the DIA Center for the Arts. You walk in, you adjust your eyes to the ambience and access the mise-en-scène of Robert Irving Excursus' Homage to the Square. There is a rigorous geometry to the architecture of the installation, and yet this seemingly still environment moves, atmospherically activated over time by way of light. The scene you experience has a meteorological quality. Its looks will depend on the time of the day and the state of the weather. The product of decades of work with light and space, originated in Irwin's particular brand of Southern California minimalism, the installation engages the forms of canvas, wall, and screen in an architectural and sculptural exploration. The frame of this inquiry is announced in the title of the installation, which refers to Homage to the Square, the landmark series of paintings that Joseph Albers began in 1950 and carried on for over 25 years. The large open space of the third floor of the Dia Center for the Arts appears transformed, as if the canvases that Albers conceived as architectures have materialized in an actual dynamic architecture. Here, Irwin exposes the potential of the square, using scrims to create 18 similarly constructed rooms. Stretched and invisibly attached to frames, these scrims appear to function as walls. They not only form partitions, but also create openings in the shape of doors. But these walls have a particular character. Made of diaphanous fabric, they're light, and they defy the gravity of enclosure. As they dematerialize the tectonics of wall, such forms also materialize into another surface. The fabric of their lightness creates a veiled architecture and a subtly textured space. The screen walls are made of a delicate sheer fabric that is not transparent, but rather translucent. The material reflects and absorbs the natural and artificial light that constitutes an important part of the installation's atmospheric architecture. At either ends of the space, there is a source of luminosity in the forms of large windows, but like the screen walls, these windows confound their given architecture. They're gel-covered, such as they no longer simply frame the light, but rather filter it. In creating another stratum of luminous filter, they act less like window and more like sheer partitions. They too become scrims. Further illumination comes from fluorescent lights positioned within the space. They're tubes wrapped in layers of theatrical gels that contribute an eerie, bluish color glow. The use of transparent plastic film further enhances the atmospheric effect of the installation, in clear homage to Albers' own painterly studies of color textures and hues. Walking further into the space, you become increasingly aware of its layered visual fabrication, filtered through screens that are essentially veils. Light itself appears layered, coated, and textures. As the veil's bluish light bathes the room with ambience, you become more and more immersed in such a textured atmosphere. As you remain over time, the atmosphere becomes as palpable as fabric, and you sense its weathering. Like climate, the stratified environment is anything but static, and it is fundamentally as temporal as any state of weather. As if you were in a landscape, here subtle shifts of luminosity occur over time, phenomenologically changing not only the tone, but also the mood of the ambient space. Like any atmosphere, which by definition is something pervasive, the work is enveloping, absorbing, immersive. As you're immersed in the density of these superficial, environmental effects, your awareness of surfaces amplifies. You begin to sense the change of light on fabric, as if you were affecting your own skin. A conflation of materials takes place on the texture of the scrims, which takes on a cinematic form. The scrims effectively assume the meaning of a pellicule, that is, of film, celluloid, the material skin that itself reflects, absorbs, and responds to light. The more the durational fabric of light is registered on the scrims, the more the force of the cinematic pervades the installation. As viewers walk through the layers of scrims, sensing their architectural presence in space, it is, after all, an excursus. They too become part of the fabric of the exhibition. Appearing and disappearing through the scrims, these viewers act like actors in a film, entering into a play of light and shadow, and in the end, become shadows themselves. As the scrim activate this subtle play of transparency and shadowing, they mediate a spectatorial experience. The veils of these scrims activate rooms that are permeable viewing chambers, and thus, acting atmospherically as luminous partitions and reflective filters, the scrim walls are finally understood to be screens. They are the current of transparent bodies that can enable projection, which is itself a form of transfer and mediation of elements such as light. Their absorbent material is the same fabric that allows a screen to be, in all senses of the word, a medium. It is now 2015, and you travel upstate New York. A train ride through the light-reflecting waters of the Hudson River takes you to Dia Beacon through an atmosphere that is pastoral and painterly. As you ride the train up to see Robert Irwin's new installation of Excursus Homage to the Square, you are reminded of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, for those canvases were as atmospheric as Irwin's scrims. You enter Dia through a metal gate decorated with a mesh screen that was designed by Irwin, as was the grid of the garden outside the old factory building. Lines of trees section and screen the outdoor space, and the grass surfaces through tiny square partitions. This screened environment prepares you for the installation that, nearly 2 decades later, again presents you with scrims that atmospherically partition the space and filter the light, transforming into translucent textures that effectively act as screen fabrics. But as you look closely, you realize that something is different here in the luminous configuration of these canvas walls that are screens. The light here has changed from a dark bluish color into a lighter sensation. Also, the fluorescent lights are more decorative than in a 1998 installation, and the theatrical gels wrapped around the neon lights are more colorful. The reference to Albert is made most manifest here in terms of the architecture of color and the possible variation, although I realize here that it should have been called, instead of Homage to the Square, Homage to the Shards in Screens. Admiring the vibrant color combinations, you notice how the light emanating from inside the tubes and entering from the atmosphere outside affect and changes color tonality. As these theatrical effects unfold and affect the ambience, they create an atmospheric setting, suggesting that atmosphere is itself to be understood as a form of mise-en-scène. And finally, out of this theater of effects, a decorative filmic quality surfaces. One is reminded here of a particular theatrical ornament, the marquee, shining with colorful neon lights, decoratively adorning the exterior of old movie theaters, where Irwin actually worked. The ornamental quality of Irwin's theatrical neons enhances the surface effect of the installation. The visitor is not only attracted to the vibrant multicolored surfaces, but embraced in the surface space that they create, with shapes, shades, and hues fashioning an ambience of textural tones. And in looking carefully through the galls of the screen partitions, the viewer will notice that the lit-up double panels produce the perceptual sensation of a particular ornamental surface, moiré. In between the 2 layers of scrims, a surface effect is created that evokes the shimmering of moiré textiles and its special effects of overlay. As is the case for moiré fabric, the surface of Irwin's scrims, as pixelated as any contemporary screen, reflects light in a different atmospheric ways depending on the angle of view. Furthermore, the superficial appearance of moiré fabric has an undulating, watery consistency, and this texture manifests itself to our senses in the installation, in the interstices. Irwin's use of light makes the interstitial scrims seemingly warped and weft, as if reproducing not only the overlay, but the rippled form of moiré. Surface tension occurs in this installation. These divergent reflections of light rays through material not only make for wavy fabric, but create waves of motion through surface space. Thus reflected in the textural surfaces of Irwin's installation is the very movement of moiré textile, a material perturbation of surfaces. Irwin's Excursus thus produces an atmosphere of surface effects. In a departure from the New York installation, at Dia Beacon, each room has a different tone and temperature. One is more aware of partitions, for one can enter and exit the installation from the side panels and walk around the installation's perimeter to re-enter the rooms. For the Beacon visitor, then, there is less of a sense of meandering inside a totally embracing atmospheric space, being immersed inward, as was the case in New York, where one felt absorbed in cumulative surface space. Here, one becomes more sensible to the room's partitions and to the different atmospheres of each room, and one has more tangible sense of how the surface of the scrims, acting to partition and filter the space, creates something like various airs. As you're free to walk in and around the Dia Beacon installation, you also become aware that the architecture of the screen partitions resonates with the artist's design of the doors and the windows of the building, which are also partitioned by panels that create a grid. For one side of the building, Irwin designed windows that have some gridded panels of transparent glass surrounded by several panels of frosted glass. These window frames are much more perceptual objects as his screen partitions, with which now they are in fabulous dialogue. They make us aware of the subtle changes in the texture of light that transpires through a surface. In other words, these windows are screens. As panels that screen the light, the architectural elements of the beacon that Irwin designed convey an act of screening that is not about transparency, but about translucency. Like the scrims of the gridded installation, the window panels simultaneously filter and reflect the light in a hazy, misty, cloudy fashion. The effect is not one of pure visibility, but of subtle veiling. It is as if they were there to actually curtain the space. In fact, the windows effectively screen the light as if they were shades, curtains, or drapes. As they fashion forms of window dressing, then these apertures take even the fabric quality of Irwin's scrims. Insofar as they are meteorological filters, the window screens, like the scrims, are a permeable architecture that enables an atmospheric passage. Acting as if they were thresholds, even apertures, they resonate with the shaded, gridded doors that Irwin designed to enter and exit the building at Beacon in the same veiled geometry. In this installation, then, one can clearly sense all the meanings that are associated with the notion of screen, ranging from frame to window to door. What is most important, one senses the actual fabric of a screen, which is materially exposed here in the permeable texture of screen scrims that atmospherically filter elements and partition space. Irwin's use of scrims in both installation of Excursus, that takes us back to the elemental function of a screen. It fundamentally reminds us that the screen has an architectural origin and is atmospherically born of light. The etymological history of the word screen tells us, in fact, that screen surface originated out of a desire to transform space through luminosity and shadow play. It is therefore useful to go back to the history of the screen in order to better grasp the elemental atmospheric sense of screening space that takes place in Irwin's Excursus. It is important to emphasize that the word screen had long been used in relation to space before it was applied to the art of projection. The term appeared during the Renaissance, evolving from an earlier Germanic root in late medieval times that also transferred to Latin languages. It originally pointed to a variety of mediums, surfaces, and types of screenings, mostly emerging from the world of architecture. As the media historian Erkki Hutamo has shown, a screen designated in particular, and I quote, a floor-standing piece of furniture, consisted of a sheet of lighter, often translucent material, paper, some kind of fabric, stretched on a wooden frame or a series of connected folding frames, end quote. By the 19th century, its meaning had expanded to include a surface for projection. Transfer from architectural space to the realm of pre-cinematic media, the screen came to be defined as a type of new translucent membrane and a new form of textural materiality, a light-reflecting fabric for the transmission of luminous images. It is significant to know that the Century Dictionary Encyclopedia, published originally in 1899, defines the screens first architecturally as a covered framework, partition, a curtain, as in a folding screen or a window screen, end quote, but then includes in this form of spatial metamorphosis a screen upon which images can be cast by a magic lantern. The evolution of the term screen tells us that what we now call screen and understand to be a projective surface originated in the world of object, architecture, and material space. The screen was a thing, an object that inhabited interiors. It served especially to negotiate inside and outside, and materially, actually atmospherically, to transform space, acting in concert with light. When deployed to divide space in the home, a screen mediated between private and public zones of habitation created privacy and intimacy. Born as a fabric that served as a translucent filter, the screen lives on in modern and contemporary visual art as such piece of material culture and spatial function. Irwin's Excursus clearly embodies the etymological substance of the screen's history, for here the scrim functions as a translucent architectural partition endowed with the atmospheric ability to filter light space and thus effectively to become a cinematic screen. The permeable quality of the screen as an atmospheric filter manifested in Excursus is also present in Irwin's previous works with scrims. Excursus refashions in particular the atmospheric screen quality of screen veil, black rectangle, natural light, a work that Irwin conceived, as we heard brilliantly from Donna Di Salvo, in 1977 for the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. This large-scale installation was site-conditioned. It uniquely engaged the architecture of the Whitney's iconic building designed by Marcel Breuer, responding to it and acting on the site to transform it. The work was reinstalled there in 2013 before the museum left the brutalist space for its new home. As the title announces, Irwin hung a scrim across the length of the fourth floor gallery of the museum and marked the perimeter of the space with a black line drawn across the walls at the height of the beams at the scrim's bottom edge. This minimal yet profound gesture of intervention redefines the space architecturally, interacting with the grid of the ceiling, the dark rectangle of the floor tiles, and activating the space of light in concert with a window. The work questions the received notion that a frame implies containment and explores instead how the geometry of a scrim can extend into space, reframing it in an expansive way. The scrim creates a subtle partition into a space that otherwise appears empty, although actually is not at all a void. As Irwin himself put it in his Notes Towards a Model that were published for the 1977 exhibition, and I quote, "How is it that a space could ever come to be considered empty when it is filled with real and tactile events?" End quote. The scrim does indeed activate real and tactile events in the gallery space. For one, visitors feel compelled to position themselves in the space in relation to its geometry and the frame of the window. They stand in front of the scrim on one side or the other, crouch below it, or look in between partitions. Viewers also walk around the subtle space divider to change their perspective or view the work in motion. Although spectators do participate in the profound hapticity of the space, it is important to emphasize that, as Brian Masumi puts it, Irwin's work, and I quote, is not interactive art. There is no interaction. You have to stop acting for the perceptual event to happen. It then wells up of its own volition. It takes you. You are in it, end quote. As you stop acting in the conventional sense and rather let yourself be taken outside yourself, outward, into the atmosphere of screen veil, black rectangle, natural light, you feel how the natural light that emanates from the geometrical encasement of Breuer's large window permeates the space of the gallery. You notice the passing clouds and perceive even the most minimal change that occurs in the ether outside. Every atmospheric vibration is subtly reflected and processed inside and resonates through the fabric partition. Light itself is screened by the scrim, which is then turned quite literally into a filmic screen. Here you can sense the very history of the screen and how it changed over time, all the way from architecture to cinema. In fact, the architectural origin of the screen fabric, which I just described, materializes fully in the fabrication of this installation. Irwin's screen is a genealogical screen. It is a partition, a divider, a net, a buffer, a curtain. Most important, it is a filter, a protective shield, a material shelter of weather, a place of meteorological passage, and a site of ethereal transmission. Such a scrim is a physical object of transformation, a surface of transmission that conveys the very transport of light and of shadows. As Irwin's scrim filters the light, it is as if it were actually making shadows. In this way, the work recreates the very atmosphere of the shadow theater out of which the culture of the cinematic was born. This was not a show of transparency, but rather an opaque aesthetics. Irwin's scrim can make the space perceptibly cloudy, foggy, misty, and even hazy. It is especially attuned to the development of natural phenomena that occur in space. This is a sensitive surface that actually screens phenomena from the world. It can register temporal states and record states of matter. In particular, it can signal on its surface how temporal circumstances affect atmospheric manifestation, including the ever-changing states of luminosity and especially of cloudiness. And so, as you stand there and you stop acting, you become more sensitized to a particular experience, the creation of a microclimate. This geographic sensation is also a deeply aesthetic one. It is as if you were finally able to inhabit one of those nebular meteorological landscapes that Turner strived to make as canvas. Stripped completely bare, Irwin's scrim can render the pure meteorology of a canvas. As you linger on and you really stop acting, another cloud can appear. In your mind, you can see the cloudy sky that Constable on his canvas is rendered as sheets of clouds. And as the cloud passes by in the sky, outside the Breuer window, and a subtle nebularity is registered on the scrim, something else can happen. Irwin can get you close to sensing the layers, the actual sheets of nebular consistency, passing from canvas onto scrim. Here, you can finally perceive the actual nature of screen fabric. You can sense its own veiling of light. And so at this point, you feel the screen itself turning into a cloud. This is a nebular aesthetics, in the sense articulated by the literary scholar Stephen Connor in his essay on nebular modernism, in which he links culture to weather, emphasizing that the weather has temporality, it is pure fluctuation. Connor suggests that there is a real affinity between modernism and the nebular, and shows that, and quote, modernist haze was a phenomenon of interference, an accidental mixing of registerings and channels. It is a kind of visual noise which implicates the conditions of perception and registration in its nature, end quote. In this reading, the modernist topos of haze has today extended into a topography, turning into an actual environment. Irwin's articulation of an aesthetic of visual haze suits this paradigm, though it transforms the penchant for atmospheric noise into a much more perceptual, and I would say, environmental vibration. Haze is for Irving a necessary condition for the act of perception. I would go as far as to claim that haze is the actual manifestation of perception itself, understood as a movement in time and in space, a real perturbation. Let us reflect some more then on this perturbation. To further articulate this reading of Irving's meteorological penchant in terms of a nebular aesthetics, it is useful to turn to the writings of the French philosopher and aesthetician Hubert Damisch. His book, A Theory of Cloud, can offer us further insights as Damisch makes a clear connection between the cloud and modern aesthetics. Tracing the history of clouds in painting, he describes a radical shift that occurs in modern culture when the cloud becomes an important signifier of change, signaling an expanse of limits and the opening up of representational borders into space. Damisch writes of this shift in art as a perceptual matter, a cloudiness of vision itself. In modern art, a meteorological aesthetics is fleshed out in conjunction with a scientific interest in climate. In his words, and I quote, "Modern painters were interested in the perceptible aspects of clouds, their objective configurations, the effects of mists, the appearance of things seen through the screen of atmospheric projection. Whether the painters of the past had sought for stability, permanence, clarity, the modern spectator was invited to take pleasure in obscurity, the ephemeral, change, and to derive the greatest satisfaction and instruction from that which was the hardest to fix and understand: wind, light, cloud, shadows," end quote. As viewers of Irving's installations, we are indeed invited to participate in the changes of space through the most unstable of elements, light. Sensitized to the passage of luminosity and the clouding up of the sky, we're finally exposed to the very effect of a representational cloudiness. In other words, we experience a form of screening. After all, in screen-veiled black rectangular natural light, as in Excursus' homage to the square, we perceive nothing but the appearance of things seen through the screen of atmospheric formations. This activity of atmospheric screening encompasses effects of textural density, a cloudiness of sorts. Here, too, Damisch offers a clue to further our interpretation of Irwin's work in atmospheric ways. It is significant that when speaking of an aesthetics of the cloud, Damisch titles an important chapter, "Our Sheet's White Care." This suggests to me that the clouds themselves can be visually imagined as a sheet, that is, pictured as a white piece of fabric. Pushing this reader even further, I would add yet another twist to the story of sheets. The act of perceiving a sheet of white clouds in an artwork can aesthetically lead to the sensing of another kind of white sheet, the white textile of a painting's canvas. The history of artists' relations to clouds can be understood in such a way as being played out in this intricate shifting relation of white sheet fabrics. The evanescent representation of a white cloud expresses a desire for material texture in a play of surfaces. Irwin's environmental work itself can be inscribed in this superficial gesture, that is, in our sheet's white care. Ultimately, his use of scrims refashions a perceptual association between the white cloud and the white canvas and adds a crucial element into their mediatic mix, the white film screen. As it unfolds in layers, or rather sheets, of mediatic connection, Irwin's light and space installations thus transmit the passages that occur atmospherically across the materials of canvas, wall, and screen. In these passages, we can witness how the status of the image has changed across time. Images have come to be manifested more and more as surfaces, tones, and tonalities. A series of surface encounters comes to the fore in Irwin's installations, as his first dimension, second dimension, third dimension, fourth dimension, which you see here shows, his surfaces of light make us especially aware of the presence and configuration of an act of screening in our culture, and of the function of the screen as a cultural fabric that has an atmospheric origin in architecture. The surface of Irwin's scrims is also a shifting depository of perceptual art histories, as they expose sediments of atmospheric perturbations that were manifested in nebular art with its own history of meteorological passages of textural density. Irwin's works suggest in particular that as we think of images as surfaces, that is, as sheets, we must reflect further on the superficial relation between mediums. This practice signals that a fundamental intersection of forms has taken place, and today we can witness an important change on the surface of mediums. Distinctions are collapsing, and a form of intersection, even conflation, between canvas, wall, window, and screen is taking place. Irwin's work shows in an exemplary way that the very nature of what is traditionally understood as canvas or as wall has changed to incorporate a form that has become ever present in our culture, the screen. As his practice projects the canvas into architecture, it also creates a more permeable understanding of the notion of wall. It shows that the wall itself has changed. The architecture of the wall is no longer rigidly tectonic, but rather tensiled and textured. Such a wall embodies the property of canvas and the configuration of screen. The screen takes a center stage here, but it too appears in a fashion that differs from its usual framing. In fact, as we ponder the architecture of Irwin's installations, we may come to question canonical notions of the screen. This screen is not a window in the traditional sense. It slips away from transparency and from any conceptual framing in pure perspectival geometry or ideal. And it is also not a mirror. The screen, as it emerges here, is dressed as a different surface. It is rather reconfigured as a kind of canvas, a curtain, a sheet. Irving's scrim is as enveloping as was the so-called canvas of some of his nebular works that took painting all the way into sculpture, such as the series of untitled works from 1968, of which you see an example here. Here, the white acrylic lacquer on a plastic or metal surface jutting out of the wall resembles the reflective surface of a white film screen. Irwin said that he painted them to approach even the pearlescent granularity of a film screen. As he overcomes the limits of the frame, then, Irving embraces an expansive space. Partition, shelter, and veil. His screen is a permeable architectural envelope that performs an act of screening as he filters elements of the environment and creates atmospheres that are nebular materiality. To conclude then, through layers of screen partitions, as we have shown, sheets of nebular representation become manifested in both Excursus homage to the square and screen veil black rectangle natural light, conflating the materials of canvas and wall into screen in an atmospheric fashion. In this work, sensitive to weather conditions and meteorological passage, light activates matter in a texture, cloudy atmosphere that unveils the surface of projection. Irwin offers a reinterpretation of surface that engages ornament and texture and the nebular consistency of veil and the density of haze. In this aesthetic of minimalist simplicity, attention to material defines a surface condition that is an affirmation of materiality intended in the larger sense of that term. A material intersection between inside and outside, between interior and exterior, is played out on the surface of the scrims. A layered space of interaction between the exterior world and the space of interiority emerges over time in these nebular atmospheric installations. Deep layers of projections emerge, for the pliant screen surface that is a screen appears capable of retaining even the inner structure of temporality in the material substance of an atmosphere. Furthermore, Irwin uses light and air as a material construction and makes these light elements as solid as matter. In such a way, he not only exhibits material elements, but exposes the working of an elemental philosophy. Air and light are tools for constructing an elemental form of thinking, that is, a material conceptual reflection that is carried through actual elements of the environment. A real theory of clouds takes place here, for this is a textural reconfiguration of the actual perceptual framing of space in view of natural phenomena. Enveloping sheets of sensitive surfaces take space through the expansive meteorological aesthetics that is tuned to temporal states of matter. We can sense a new materiality being designed in this aesthetics of atmosphere. The ethereal, luminous transformations that Irwin pioneered in architectural art find correspondence today in architecture as architects themselves become more sensitive to atmosphere and get closer to the nebularity of landscape design. Atmosphere is a nebular primal matter, and as such, it now diffuses across art and spatial forms, permeating them and finally connecting them together. What is most important to emphasize here is the latitude of this concept of atmosphere, its range. Irwin's spaces create atmosphere in the largest sense of that term. Here, atmosphere indicates a sensing of space. It can express the full spectrum of the sensorium, including a sense of affect and the sensation of mood, the kind of tone that is called Stimmung. It is an atmosphere that changes and transforms over time in space in shaded tonalities for taking the temperature of a space or sensing its air also means registering a shift in affect. Hence, Irwin's atmospheric surfaces are anything but flat. Densely built up in layers, the surface is deeply tensile, a landscape of projected transformations. Such a hazy, cloudy surface, far from being superficial, is indeed a consequential and moving entity. It is a space of real dimension, which is to say, a real screen, a site that can hold the very fabric of material relations, convey their elemental depth, and register their perturbations. In other words, a place of sentient weathering. Thank you.
Okay, well, at the risk of being repetitive, I want to also thank Kelly for inviting me originally to this talk, and to everybody else at DIA for making this possible, and also to the audience for staying to the end. It's only fitting that we started with a Matthew and we're going to end with a Matthew, although I don't know that I will be as articulate as our first Matthew. I still have that maintenant in my head here. I'm going to take it home with me. And I also have that fold-out thing that Alva Noe was talking about, which Lynn Cook very kindly sent me when I was starting my research on Irwin several years ago. So what I want to do today is to talk about the original piece, the one from 1998, although I will come around to talking about the one that's up here now. Excursus, Homage to the Square Cubed, which, yes, Irwin is always very concerned that the full title be spoken when it is. But the thing that interests me, and I'm showing you two images of that piece here on the screen, the thing that interests me and that I want to talk to you about today is an anomaly. And it kind of all started from some research I was doing at the Getty, in the Getty Research Institute, and the Getty Research Institute has in their special collections Robert Irwin's papers. There's a flat file there, and in the flat file I found 3 drawings related to the 1998 project, and I'm showing you one here. It's a simple construction, simple construction document here, which shows sort of how parts of the thing was built. But what really interested me were 2 plan drawings that I found, sort of simple plan drawings that show the layout of the piece. The only difference between them, and by the way, I apologize for my amateur photography here. This is the first of those plan drawings, and then the second one is this one. And the thing that interested me most about this was the title that you're seeing there. I'm going to zero in on it right there. This is the title that we just heard. 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimension, 4 dimension. We normally would think this is 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, 4 degree, which is sort of anybody trained in geometry might think that, but actually Irwin does not want us to read it that way. He wants us to read it as 1 first dimension, 2nd dimension, 3rd dimension, 4th dimension. And I'm going to come back to this drawing in a second, but the reason why I was sort of surprised to find this is that I've never seen this title associated with this project before. The 2 titles that are usually associated with this project are Prologue times 18 cubed, which is the first part, and then the second part, Excursus, Homage to the Square Cubed. So I began to wonder, was this just something Irwin toyed with in the beginning, perhaps, calling it this, but then ultimately deciding to use the other titles I mentioned. So I dug around a little bit. Sure enough, I found it in other places, for instance, in this Dia installation material list, where you see the title again, and I'm going to come back to it as well. Perhaps most importantly, on this final axonometric drawing, which shows sort of the layout of the piece again in that axonometric rendering, you see the title there again as well. So, and I don't want to overemphasize titles in Irwin's work because titles are kind of a handle he uses, but I do think this one is important, and it's going to help me, I hope, articulate, if I can speak over the bathroom flushing, to articulate some basic ideas that I think are fundamental to this piece. And that is that it is fundamentally about issues of time and temporality. So first I'm going to do a little obligatory art historical background here. Hold on one second. No, maybe I'm not going to. I'm going to leap right in to this. Right. Hold on one second. So Irwin was first invited to create an installation at the Dia Art Foundation in 1996. He was kind of in the midst of working on his Getty garden, so he was very busy, but he did have an opportunity to come and walk the site. This, of course, is the site that we just heard about, 548 West 22nd Street in the Chelsea neighborhood, walking the 4 floors of the building, taking mental notes about the space, its architectural qualities, the points of egress and ingress, the quality of light at different times of day, the feeling of the spaces, and so on. And he requested floor plans to continue his reflections once he got back home in San Diego. These seem to have been faxed to him, so what we're looking at here is first and second floors, and then we're looking at third and fourth floors here. He also appears to have picked up a bunch of postcards of different Dia installations previously, so he could see how other artists had engaged with the building's open spaces, most of them inevitably pushing the architecture itself into the background as a kind of foil against the work itself. Even when the columns, beams, or floors were used as display surfaces, such as in the Wiener and Holzer installations, the architecture was still more or less a backdrop for the art, receding visually and conceptually as a ground against which the artwork stood out as a figure. And this is where the art historical background comes in. So for Irwin's part, he had since the mid-1960s been concerned to destabilize the figure and ground distinctions that usually were assumed to exist between a work and its architectural context, seeking to break the frame, as he puts it, between the work and its surrounds, between the ergon and the parergon. Light and shadow became critical factors for him in this process, especially in his dot and disc paintings, one of which I'm showing you here. This is the same one that's on display right now at the Hirshhorn. By 1970, however, Irwin turned to using light and shadow as ways to subtly reconfigure architectural spaces, generating volumetric divisions with scrim and other materials, and adding artificial light in certain cases or removing it in others. And so here I'm thinking of the Ace Gallery volume in 1971, or the Walker volume of the same year, or even the Whitney piece that we've heard about today from 1977. So in the two former pieces, Irwin added light to activate the scrim and the surrounding space with qualities of subtly differentiated light energy, whereas at the Whitney, he removed all artificial light and worked exclusively with the natural light streaming in from this asymmetrical window we've heard about. Irwin's point was to lay bare the aesthetic value of light, shadow, and volume already present in ostensibly empty architectural spaces, making already existing ambient conditions the work of art, therefore, became an implicit challenge to the conventional definition of art as object, shifting attention back on the viewer and her or his heightened sensitivity to light, shadow, and volume as the art itself. So, returning to Dia, Irwin eventually zeroed in on the third floor, in part because of the 2 rows of windows along the north and south faces of the building, and the natural light they allowed into the space. His first step was to remove partition walls and expose the geometry of the ceiling beams and support columns. He seems to have toyed early on with the idea of creating a progression of 14 evenly spaced parallel scrim veils following the sequence and number of transverse concrete beams on the ceiling. And we see this in a sketch that's jotted on a torn out New Yorker magazine page, probably maybe drawn on the airplane on the way back home, who knows. But he did eventually shift his attention to the implied cube-like volumes created by the supporting columns, and he had to add columns to kind of emphasize that. So he decided to add columns and beams to create a total of 18 equally proportioned scrim cubicles with double scrim walls and wood-framed open doorways, which we see set forth in his drawings for the project. So the construction drawing I showed earlier is all about how those were to be built. And in this one here, you're kind of seeing the plan view. And we also see in this plan view the architectural void on the north side of the building, which gave the installation an off-center U-like shape. You can kind of see that here. So these are photographs that Kelly very kindly shared with me, and they're very illuminating because they show the original installation of this piece. They give you a sense of how the sort of wood framing was built, how the where additional columns were put in, and beams, and just so you don't have a sense that nobody actually worked on this just appeared. There is Bob himself at work with assistants. I think that's him up on that scaffolding thing, I'm not sure. But it's definitely him on the right. So, okay, the drawings and notes that I've been looking at indicate that from the very beginning, Irwin's plan was to create a sequential piece, which would have not one, but 2 iterations, one piece in 2 parts. And these 2 iterations or stages would be differentiated from one another, not by a change in the structure of the installation, that is to say, the disposition of the 18 cubicles, but in the number and color of the fluorescent tubes. And I bring back this, I showed you it earlier. You can see here, I don't know if you can make it out up there, but he says already in this early kind of oh, thank you. In this early set of notes here, already that it's got 2 stages. You can see that on number 2 there, he says 96-inch fluorescent fixtures, 72 fixtures, first installation, and then 72 fixtures, second installation. Also, you see it here. If you look down towards the bottom, which is impossible probably to do, but you can see he talks about first and second, the addition of new ones. And I just want to kind of bring you back to this, which is the plan drawing here. What he wanted to do, and this is different from what he wound up doing, was to have going north-south, sort of going horizontally there, rows of double fluorescent tubes. And I have a detail here to show you, and even a better detail. See how in each there would be double tubes going across on either side of the scrim walls. And then for the second installation, he would simply add more tubes on the east-west. So it would simply double the amount of light, double the amount of tubes. And you can see already in this drawing here, and I'm going to zero in on this, note the title again, the original title on here. Zeroing right on in there, you can see that these tubes already are indicated as having gels on them. You can kind of see that little central section, okay? But double, right? Okay, so for the final, and Bob does this, you know, he always allows change to happen up to the last minute. That's the whole point of his process. He decided in the end to reduce the number of bulbs to 1, but still do that, that north-south kind of installation of the bulbs. And these bulbs were unified. They were all the same kind of color. I want to get back to my to here. So he ultimately adjusted his idea for the first installation, which became called Prologue times 18 cubed, reducing the amount of bulbs to 70, from 72 to 36. So he didn't want to have double bulbs, he wanted single ones, hanging them singly rather than in pairs. He wrapped these 8-foot bulbs with theatrical gels, dividing the bulb into 2 outer, asymmetrical, bright sections and 1 inner, steely blue section with 2 6-inch, slightly lighter fringes. And you see it better on this slide, actually, if you kind of see that. And the top and the bottom are not the same length. They're smaller on top and on the bottom, the exposed part. Okay. Irwin also added gray-tinted adhesive gels to the windows to gently soften the light coming from outside, so that toward the north and south ends of the grid, a dialogue between natural and artificial light would develop, with patterns of light falling across and through the scrim walls, whereas toward the center of the installation, natural light faded and artificial light became more dominant. And there's a couple views of that. For the second part, Irwin kept the scrim rooms at 18, but increased the number of fluorescent lights to 144, hanging 4 sets of 2 tubes in each room. So that's a sort of a 4-fold increase rather than the doubling that he was thinking of. The bulbs were also wrapped in a much greater range and number of differently colored or toned gels, with all 8 bulbs in a single room wrapped the same way. This gave each cubicle a distinct chromatic quality in contrast with the sense of unified color energy in the first installation. Irwin created so there's another shot of that. Irwin created an installation book to keep track of the complex wrappings in the second stage, Excursus, Homage to the Square Cubed. And I won't torture you by going through this in detail, but you can basically track all, like this bulb, this is one bulb on the left for one of the rooms, and it tells you, which are the various filters and gels that he's using, and then he has a kind of a legend at the back, so you can track them down, find out which ones. So this is the installation book. But I just want to be really clear about this. This installation book is not the record of an a priori plan. Irwin has explained that the process of deciding on his colors, on the layers and sequencing of the wrapped gels, both then and now, was an entirely intuitive and trial and error process in which endless testing, switching, comparing, and so on resulted finally in a decision to hold on to just one permutation because, in Irwin's words, it felt right. And the complexity, these are my amateur photographs again, the complexity in this new installation is even more incredible. And he actually, Michael Armstrong who is sort of responsible for fabricating these, has made books for this one as well. Instead of having one installation book, he has actually these large foam core 8-foot books that are you essentially open up, and you have right there a sample of all those gels that are overlapped. He calls this a kind of deconstruction of the gels put into this box. Here's a second box, so that this is a record now of the decisions that were finally made. So there's a lot of this behind the scenes. I think it is interesting, though, and important that Irwin decided to make this Dia piece a sequential installation. Reviews even noted that the piece was divided into part 1 and part 2. And Irwin has jokingly justified the sequencing in the following way, and this was in an interview with Carol Deal. He said, "I've experienced on a number of occasions before that when one puts something unabashedly sensual in New York, everyone gags. So I gave them a more formal and more disciplined situation first to kind of ease them into it." And so that's the end of the quote. So, according to Irwin, the first part was a preparation, a kind of conditioning. After the summer closure, when Dia was closed, Irwin came in and kind of made a few alterations and most importantly changed the bulbs. And then when it reopened, visitors discovered that color had bloomed throughout this scrim labyrinth. And one critic observed that in one room of the new iteration, for example, quote, "the salient color might be a deep maroon inflected by white and silvery gray that pick up faint maroon echoes. In another, a mustardy gold with white and pale greenish blue-silver accents is the scheme." And so on, each combination subtly modulating your perception of the space, end quote, and that's Grace Glueck. Differences then came to the fore both between the two iterations and in the second iteration, between the chromatic qualities of different scrim rooms and so on. But I want to be careful here because this in fact undercuts the importance of the first iteration, which was already playing heavily on differences. And I think, why am I bringing that back? I don't know. I'm going to stick with this. So in prologue, I'll just sort of show you this one again. Irwin presented a space that was unified in terms of the distribution of the rooms and even the repeated light fixture. But as one moved through the space, a strange effect of parallax occurred, generated by the slowly reorienting lines of receding lights seen through the scrim walls. And you get that same effect up here in this one. One grasped intellectually the repetition of like units, the grid-like distribution of space, but from a perspectival experiential perspective, this spatial gestalt was contradicted by the constantly reorienting lines that seemed to triangulate around and to follow the visitor from room to room. And this was also evident in the second installation, Excursus, in which each scrim room was now chromatically differentiated. A spatial gestalt was still available to the intellect, but this conceptual, abstract knowledge was increasingly inconsistent with the experience of the space in the duration of one's stroll from scrim volume to scrim volume, in which qualitative differences became the basis for decisions to turn left or right, or to continue straight, or to return on one's tracks. Time then, or sequencing, was key to this piece from the very outset, and this point at long last brings me back to this title. So the titles, prologue, for example, indicates a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something is still to come. Whereas excursus, as we have heard previously, implies a digression upon or an afterthought about an already articulated theme. I've always thought that maybe there's, what's in between there? There's something missing in the middle there. Time is also the point of the title I found on the drawings. First dimension, second dimension, third dimension, fourth dimension. It reads a bit like a progression or a sequence from point, one dimension, to plane, two dimension, to space, three dimension, to time, fourth dimension. This is not time spatialized, but rather space temporalized. Is that what you say? And we do know that time was of concern to Irwin while he was working on the Dia project. It's the subject, for example, of notes he jotted on an envelope in which he was keeping his receipts related to the DIA project. And so you can kind of see him here. I'll read him out to you. He's got time twice on there and something else in there. He says, time as a series of discrete increments capable of underwriting a concept or system of measure with both repeatability and predictability. Or, time as an infinitely subtle continuum, experientially malleable, faster, slower, imploding, exploding. Two ways of thinking about time then, and I love the little Clintonian relativism thrown in there, which is what us art historians love to call, what is it, like a something ad quem, a terminus ad quem or something. It's like, it helps us date this. We know that's 1998, right? So anyway, back to this thing about time, a conceptual system of time, which is an abstraction, must be distinguished, according to Irwin and the train, from the experience of time, which unfolds as a continuum, but is not uniform and has imploding and exploding moments, prologues and excursus, malleable and flexible. Irwin's point is not to pit two understandings of time against one another. Certainly not, since he grasped the importance of each. Without the abstraction, for example, those trains wouldn't run on schedule. We wouldn't have got here on time for this talk, or our talks. But if the abstraction is used to account for all forms of temporal experience, it overreaches. Abstraction has its place, but it is categorically distinct from the kind of direct experience that interests Irwin. And we can say more about that, this issue of time as a collectivizing or singularizing kind of phenomenon. And there is yet something more I need to say about this title, and I see I'm running on, so I want to hurry here. And that is to note that this title was actually recycled. It was used twice before. One time for a piece at the DIA Art Foundation, at the Pace Gallery in New York in 1992, which he also entitled First Dimension, Second Dimension, Third Dimension, Fourth Dimension. And also for this piece, which we saw a minute ago, a piece at the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, which involved 3 square cuts in a bay window overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Now, this piece at the Pace Gallery in New York consisted of a sequence of scrim walls with gel-wrapped fluorescent lights tucked against the ceiling. The scrims were painted with large, identical black rectangles at the center, which could be seen through them as a kind of suspended series of spatial planes stepping away in space. And then this one, these sequence of these 3 similar-looking sort of cuts in the window, each then had was made of repeated identical structural units, 5 scrim corridors in one, 3 window cuts in another. And then, if we turn to our DIA installation, 18 scrim rooms, all distributed in a non-hierarchical manner, either as a sequence, a row, or a grid. In each case, as a result, the visitor was given no external criterion with which to order her or his process of moving between these repeated elements or volumes. There was no implied beginning, middle, or end. No one unit was more important than another, which meant that they could be encountered in any order that the visitor desired. This sense of identical units, however, is itself a conceptual abstraction, since while one might be aware that the scrim aisles or window cuts or scrim cubicles are identical or apparently identical, the experience of these units and their relationships to one another was marked by difference and singularity. In fact, one way to think of Irwin's conditional art in general is in terms of a re-singularizing of space through time. My experience of this space here and now is unique, never to be repeated, since conditions will always have shifted and become reconfigured. It is this uniqueness that Irwin emphasizes, and these three projects represent a new development in this ambition to accomplish this. At pace, the repeated scrim aisles were differentiated in terms of color, while in San Diego, the window cuts were differentiated by ambient conditions, breezes blowing in from outside, smells, or what was visible through them. So the DIA project was the third and last time Irwin used the generic title, first dimension, second dimension, third dimension, fourth dimension. As such, it is also the culmination of Irwin's explorations on this topic. It consists of a space divided into repeated units belonging to an easily grasped spatial structure that nevertheless addresses the spectator not as the possessor of conceptual maps and diagrams, but as a perceiving individual developing a novel stream of empirical experience here and now, that is, in time. This space, however, was divided not once, but twice, first as prologue and second as excursus. For those who got to see both, such as myself, I'm very lucky, comparisons could be made between the first and second parts. Differences multiplied, both in experience and in memory. As a non-hierarchical structure, Irwin's Dia piece placed maximum responsibility on the shoulders of the visitor. And this is how Irwin put it to me in a conversation. He said, I'd been talking about this idea of a conditional art for a very long time, and what I did was actually accomplish it. That every decision had to be intuitive or instinctual or tactile. You decide to go this way or that way. But there was no beginning, no middle, and no end. So there's no hierarchical structure to it at all. And at the end, after you wander for a while, you just ended it yourself because there was no solution to it. So this, I think, also is the gist of the title, first dimension, second dimension, third dimension, fourth dimension, and I am coming to my end, I promise here. The emphasis falls on the temporal experience of space free from teleology, free from means-end rationality, a spontaneous stream of individual aesthetic experience structured each time in new formations and sequences. In the absence of any developmental or curatorial narrative, the decisions are unassisted and therefore take place at the level of intuitive sensory differentiation and spontaneous aesthetic judgment. I want to go into this reddish room first, not that greenish one, which I'll keep for later. But prologue, and this is a point I really want to stress, was already alert to precisely these differences as well. No two rooms, in fact, were exactly the same in terms of light or in terms of the way they looked at different times of day. And this also reminds us that our own experience is also always renewed, always novel. As William James put it, we all seem to be big William James admirers up here, experience is always budding into new forms. And the opportunity to see again or see anew is at the very core of Irwin's art and of his aesthetic philosophy. And that's kind of where I want to just sort of draw it to a close and leave you with my amateur shots of the piece up here, which is so wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for sticking around to the end, and thank you all for these rich and insightful presentations, and I think it's given us a lot to think about for a very long time. Before I open it up to questions, I have one really quick question for you, Jeffrey, which I think was on a number of people's minds and a few Google searches. What happened to the Corning Glass building?
Right.
Why haven't I been to it? What's the...
It's a sad story. So the building was remodeled by Guafmi and Siegel in the 90s.
Okay.
And the lobby, the Albers mural still exists.
Okay.
But the lobby itself now has, the marble columns have been wrapped in a kind of semi-reflective silver, kind of very 90s aesthetic kind of tubes. And there's a drop ceiling now in this space, which has light coming from above, but there is no black glass anymore. It's a sad story.
That's tragic. We can...
But if you want to go there, it's on 5th Avenue, in between 55th and 56th Street, right next to the Trump building.
Ooh. Maybe we can lobby to have it restored.
Yeah.
So does anybody in the audience have any questions? I'm sure there was a lot to think about. And that? Okay, right there.
I'd like to make a comment in addition to what Matthew said, because I think it sheds a lot of light on Irwin's process, and that is when he configured the Chelsea, he didn't realize till later that he had created a non-hierarchical space. Even though he had always wanted to do so, he didn't realize until it was completed that it was non-hierarchical, which lends a lot to his idea of site conditioning. In other words, it was truly site conditioned. It wasn't conditioned by some ordained idea that he was going to do something non-hierarchical.
Right. I hope I didn't imply that there was sort of a plan, and he was but it was an idea that he was exploring, and Carol Deal, who's the one who's responsible for the quote that I took, that's a very important point, and it's true with this iteration as well, that it was all done through this process of kind of intuitive and conditional response.
Oh, we have right up front.
Thank you. I'd like to get the panel's reaction to this interpretation. Walter Benjamin, in a very famous paper, talked about the effect of modernity on the loss of aura. And so I would like to suggest that Robert Irwin has restored aura to art.
Okay. I guess everyone is looking this way. Well, one way in which we might think of this is to reinterpret the idea of aura and what aura means in Benjamin and what aura might mean for Irwin. One of the interesting ways of thinking about that is to actually take Benjamin's notion of aura in the sense of historicity and cultural change to the idea itself, which makes it much closer associated to the notion of atmosphere and to the generative notion of atmosphere, Stimmung, as well. So one can actually could argue, to, instead of saying as replace the aura in terms of the unicity or the auratic space of the work of art, but rather to transform the sense in which we understand the concept of aura itself and see it more connected to notions of atmosphere which were emerging and had emerged out of other German aesthetics before. So there is a way in which that can play into it without talking about restoring emblematic or auratic things. But that's from my perspective.
I think also, to add to that, we might think about Irwin and Irwin's prohibition on photographing his work, reproducing it in that manner, as something that challenges the kind of auratic experience that was lamented.
Mm-hmm.
There was some reference made to one point to an anechoic chamber, which is a sensory deprivation chamber, and then Lawrence Wexler's biography, where he talks a lot about Irwin's sort of need to isolate himself, and I think there was a period of time where he actually isolated himself for like 6 months on the Isle of Ibiza, I think. So it relates to sort of the perceptual experience that he often talks about, trying to kind of limit the sort of overwhelming, overstimulated, sense, and coming at a place sort of perceptual cleansing, as it were. So I guess I'm wondering about what your thoughts were about that, but also just interestingly in terms of this culture where sensory stimulation is so intense, and his thoughts about trying to constrain it in some ways and to sort of free up just his own sort of perceptual apparatus, and both from a psychological and a kind of a perceptual, sort of notion. So.
Donna had mentioned the anechoic chamber and showed the wonderful photograph of it. And you're referring to this experience on the island of Ibiza, which he does talk about often and sees really as a kind of almost origin of some of his relationships to what he calls this sort of individual perceptual experience, this idea of a kind of a reduction or you mentioned cleansing, but he talks more in terms of a kind of stripping out. And I think for him how can you speak for him? Too bad he's not here. We'll explain himself. But I think he does, I don't want to disagree with Alva's wonderful talk, but I do think he does subscribe to a notion that there is something private. There's a private experience that is in relationship to a collective experience, and the two are not the same, and that they are complementary, but they're also exclusive of one another. And so I think that and that he's not an either-or person. That's the key to him. He's a both-and thinker, that human experience is always both. It's always private perceptual, private experience happening simultaneously with a kind of operating in collective forms, using language, all this kind of stuff. And that these things are qualitatively different, and they cannot be reduced to one another, nor should they be. So I think that part of the experience on Ibiza was the revelation that there was this other kind of thing. The only thing I can think of it as is a kind of almost radical, kind of empirical getting back to this kind of thing, which is not to say, and again, this is sort of maybe my response to Alva's wonderful talk, which is that it's not about a kind of primitive, it's about a forward. The idea that there's a stream of experience happening at all times, and that it's about sort of keying into the novelty of that, the novelty of each moment, and encountering it as a new moment rather than associating it with memories, broader cultural things, and always sort of reaching abstraction through it. At least this is the way I understand him to think about it. And that's what I try to stress, is what he thinks about these things. And we can, of course, then agree or disagree with them, but I think that's what I've understood about it. I don't know if that's one way to answer, but maybe others have other kinds of comments to make on this question.
It seemed to me that this, from what I understand also, the sort of deprivation in a way that goes on in the chamber also meant that exiting there was an intensifying of the experience of the space and of the city. That's something that he said in some interviews, which I found interesting. So in a sense, it's a stripping away, which also gives rise to the possibility of a much deeper sensitivity to the actual perception of the space around it and all of the different transformations and vibrations that go on in a space. So just to enhance what you have said in terms of the relation between a kind of an inside and an outside, and a collective and a private.
And you could take that even further if we think about John Cage's time in an anechoic chamber, in which he wanted to find an environment in which there was no sound, but discovered that he could hear his blood coursing through his veins and his nervous system functioning, so that the internal sound actually is still there.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to ask Juliana a question. I enjoyed very much many of the points you made, but one thing that you said puzzled me a little bit, and I'd like to get your reaction and maybe some of the other people. You seemed to say, if I heard you right, that you needed to stop and stop moving and stop acting in order to see certain things? Okay.
No, I never said that in the least. The work is, when I said in Excursus, I also mean to say it's traveling through space, it's sequential, and it's about moving. When I meant, I cited Brian Massumi when he said you have to stop acting in a sense that it is not interactive art. So there's a difference between engaging in an artwork and an artwork being interactive, in the sense in which interactive is understood now. You know, sort of you interact with the work, you change it. It's not that kind of interaction. It's an interaction like the way in which we were talking about it. You in a sense have to come to depriving yourself of all your possibilities of wanting to actually act in order for actions to spring out of yourself and to be able to respond to the work itself. So I was just citing Brian Massumi's sense of in which he understands what you need to do in order to be taken into the space itself and follow its trajectory, and at the same time activate inside yourself a trajectory that responds to the trajectory of the work.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think first, Alba had a question.
One thing which is interesting in Matthew Sims's presentation for me was your use of the word intention, and this is all by way of sort of characterizing this project of Irwin's. But it's always fascinating when you hear an artist speak about a creation process to see how many how many decisions, maybe decision is actually the word I meant to say, how many decisions are made, how many different kinds of decisions are made, and what their basis is. Sometimes the basis is intuitive, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's dictated, but there's always an interesting story there. Now, it's also true that in this kind of work, it may not be interactive, but it invites activity, and in some sense, it invites decisions, to go left, to go right, to go red, to go green. But I wonder whether decision means the same thing there as it means when we use it in application to the creator. And part of why this is related actually to your very astute and sensitive criticism of what I said is that as the psychologist reminded me from the University of Connecticut a little while ago, a very important notion here when thinking about the exploration of an environment is the notion of affordance. It may be that each room is the same and that there's no, each room is the same in the sense, every room is different, but it might be that each room, there's not a clear rationale for deciding which way to go. So it has to be intuitive, it has to be responsive, it has to be in the moment. On the other hand, it's not quite consciously undertaken. And so I wonder if we need to think about or investigate the ways in which actually the environment is leading you through the room in ways that fit more with a kind of openness to the environment conception of experience rather than a sort of private intuitive notion. That was not very articulate.
Right,
Sorry.
no. The environmental, right, okay.
Did you understand me?
I understood most of it, and that's fine. That's, I'm slow, so that's just me. It's not you. Yes and no. I kind of feel like, the way I've usually approached this is to try to sort of mine what the artist is sort of trying to say about the intentions. That was the right word for me, at least, because he does talk about intention very much, the intention of the artist to arrive, to kind of finally decide on this. And then also the intention, not the intention, but let's say the responsibility of the person coming into the piece to make a decision. Well, I'm going this way, not that way. In fact, that's the entire rationale of this place that we're in as well, and the split doorways and the split experience you get when you come, at least according to Irwin. And I'm convinced that Excursus in 1998 was what allowed him to think this. In other words, it was the incubation in some ways for this, which is what makes it so odd in some ways to have this new version of it inside all of this. I think of it as a third iteration. And I also wonder what happened to prologue, because that was part of the original piece, you know. But I'm drifting off of your thing, though, intentionally.
well, I mean, I just wonder, the word decision has a sort of intellectual flavor to it.
Okay.
That doesn't quite seem as apt in application to the kind of feeling of being led or wandering or exploring on the part of the visitor.
Right.
But that's just a...
No, yeah.
Donovan, you still have a comment?
Am I loud? I didn't know. It's okay? I can...
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I was disqualified because I participated. I was thinking a lot, Matthew, about your presentation, and it summoned up my memory, actually, of that piece at DIA Center for the Arts. And one of the things I thought a lot about, I remember at the time, because John Chamberlain also had an installation, I think, over at Pace simultaneously. And I had this very, very distinct memory of thinking of these two artists who were getting to kind of an advanced stage at that point. And I don't know if others have felt that, but I thought when you were talking about the non-hierarchical, the kind of, in a sense, not abstraction, because that's not what it's about, but this thing that is almost undefinable, but that actually comes so close, in a sense, to the very nature of living itself. That's what I thought about with that piece. And I also thought only maybe someone who's lived a longer time could do that. And I'm just wondering if anyone else has had that response, because when we look at the trajectory of the scrim pieces, they become increasingly more complex, more chambered. There are more decisions, intuitive or otherwise, that one needs to make. So not to put it back on Bob personally, but he makes choices that in part are conditioned by the site, but also by his own lived experience. So I just wanted to ask if others have ever had that kind of response or thought of it in that way.
When I saw that piece, it was 1998, I was a graduate. I had just finished my PhD. I was in New York, and I got to see, luckily, I came twice and got to see the two iterations, and it was a huge revelation to me from a very different perspective. And now what you're saying, it resonates now that I know a lot more because of the way in which there was a kind of increasing complexity, a more architectural kind of enlargement, much instead of a scrim in a part of a room, it's now this entire kind of orchestration of volumetric experience, which I think is a kind of evolution in his thinking, this notion of volume and our awareness of it, and it's and the way in which we take it for granted. But I came from graduate school where I'd never heard Robert Irwin's name before, because he wasn't one of the anointed ones, you know? And so I was, so who is this artist? And it took a long time for me to find time to eventually explore it and find out. And that's something to do with the biases of American academia and art history departments and criticism, quite frankly. But so that was kind of mine, but maybe I'll kick the ball down.
It's interesting. I mean, I was thinking today how also, because the work is not only about the intention or the decision of the artist, but also about the experience of the visitors, and that also means how much of your own experience you, in a sense, you layer over the sheets of the work itself. And then I realized that there's also like a memory that stays with you of it, which is somewhat subjective, you know. At a certain point, I realized that when I saw it in 1998, I was totally mesmerized by this piece, and it stayed with me for a very, very long time. And I only wrote about it years later, but it's almost as if it informed a lot of my thinking about issues having to do with movement through space and architectural experiences, and even environmental and atmospheric ones, which is kind of the latest incarnation of the surfaces. I ended up on the cover of my last book years later, but only because it was really inside of me for the longest time. But I experienced the 98 piece almost as a more internal experience, probably because, I mean, it's interesting what you're saying, because yes, it is true that here it's more volumetric and it even feels more architectural because it is inside the architecture that is built, and I was thrilled, to be able to actually see the dialogue between his conception of the space and the windows, the doors, and the whole space in this, but in the Dia iteration, there was a sense, because you really couldn't exit outside of the installation, that you were sort of immersed in this kind of more meandering and yet more internal kind of space. And it felt even darker in some way, more opaque in some form, because it was really about you, being led by something, but without being able to exit it. While here you have this choice, and it makes the grid much more perceivable, and it also makes you look. I mean, obviously the quality of the lights are more pronounced in this. I mean, it was wonderful, that thing that you showed with how many. I sensed it by looking at it, but actually physically seeing how many strata of those gels went over, you realize that there is an effect of change between the two that has to do with this as well.
I think there's also something about the 98, 99 piece that has to do with its situation in Chelsea. And you really beautifully characterized this in your talk, where you're moving from a very different kind of environment than Beacon, New York, into a very special kind of space, a space that feels very special. And for me, that was also my first exposure to Irwin, but visiting that piece. And it also has remained with me. We were speaking at lunch that there are very few pieces that, in light of Matthew's talk this morning, how long does it take to understand it, and it is forever.
Yes.
Because for some reason there's something about it that in that iteration is quite powerful in a very subtle way, and I don't know what that is, but I suspect that it has something to do with the carving out of a little bit of kind of sacred space in the city. Something maybe like Donna was talking about with the projects that were external to the museum in the 77 project.
So I think that we're actually out of time. I'm sorry, but we have to close off. But I want to thank you, everybody, again for coming, and again, thank you to the presenters for your wonderful talks today. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.